at the bottom of the world, where the wind screams like something alive and the sun can vanish for months at a time. Antarctica stretches outward in endless white silence. No trees, no cities, no signs of human memory, just frozen time, layered mile upon mile, sealing away whatever once touched this place. Feels empty, untouched, and yet that feeling is an illusion, because long before satellites traced its outline, long before modern explorers froze and starved trying to cross it, someone somehow already knew it was there. The story begins not with icebreakers or research stations, but with parchment. In a dimly lit archive, far from Antarctica's frozen winds, a medieval map rests behind glass. Its edges are frayed. Its ink has browned with age. At first glance, it looks like many other early maps. Coastlines exaggerated, monsters lurking in oceans, compass roses blooming like flowers. But then the eye notices something unsettling. At the bottom of the page, where medieval cartographers usually placed decorative flourishes or blank space labeled unknown, there is land. Not imagined land. Not mythical islands. A coastline. Curves with eerie precision. Bays. Peninsulas. Mountain ranges sketched faintly, almost hesitantly, as if the mapmaker feared drawing too much. And strangest of all, the land is shown without ice. No glaciers. No frozen barrier. Just rock, rivers, and contours. The way Antarctica would look if its miles-thick ice sheet were stripped away. This map predates the official discovery of Antarctica by more than 300 years. That alone should be impossible. But impossibility becomes something else when another detail emerges. Etched subtly near the coastline is a symbol. A simple cross, equal-armed, stark, and unmistakable to those who know it. Not a church cross. Not a national emblem. But a mark long associated with a group whose history is drenched in secrecy, betrayal, and vanished knowledge. The Knights Templar. At first, scholars dismissed the idea. Coincidence, they said. Artistic license. A misinterpretation of South America stretched too far south. That explanation worked, until the coastline was compared with modern seismic scans beneath Antarctica's ice. The match was too close, too precise, and too detailed to be guesswork. How could a medieval order, sworn to vows of poverty and obedience, possess knowledge of a continent buried beneath ice thousands of years before their time? The question grows heavier when we consider what Antarctica represents. Not just a place, but a boundary, the edge of the known world. In medieval thought, the south was a realm of extremes, heat or cold beyond endurance, a mirror to the north, a place where normal rules no longer applied. To travel, there was not merely exploration. It was defiance. And yet, the Templars were not strangers to defiance. They were warrior monks, forged in the crucible of the Crusades, bound by faith but empowered by kings. For nearly 2 centuries, they walked a dangerous line between devotion and dominance. They guarded pilgrims. They fought wars. They built a financial system that allowed wealth to move invisibly across borders. They answered only to the Pope. And in the shadows of their power, they collected something more dangerous than gold. Knowledge. Knowledge taken from Jerusalem, from Constantinople, from ruins older than Christianity itself. Knowledge whispered between initiates, encoded in symbols, geometry, and ritual. Knowledge that, if revealed too soon, could destabilize the world that relied on obedience and belief. By the early 14th century, that world turned against them. On a single night, Friday, October 13, 1307, the order was betrayed, arrested en masse, accused of heresy, blasphemy, and secret rites, tortured until confessions were extracted, burned when silence remained. Officially, the Templars were destroyed. Unofficially, too much went missing. Their treasure was never found. Their fleet vanished from known ports. Entire commanderies emptied overnight. And their records, meticulous, obsessive records, simply ceased. History tells us they dissolved. But history also tells us something else, quietly, almost apologetically. No one knows where they went. This is where the map returns. Because maps are not just drawings. They are declarations of certainty. To draw a coastline is to claim knowledge. To draw it accurately is to claim experience. Someone had been there, someone had seen it, or someone had inherited information from those who had. And Antarctica is not the kind of place one stumbles upon by accident. To reach it requires planning, resources, and navigation skill far beyond what medieval Europe is usually credited with. But the Templars were not ordinary medieval men. They moved armies across continents. They coordinated supply chains across oceans. They understood stars, currents, and coded routes. Their ships were rumored to be faster, stronger, and more capable than their contemporaries. If they fled Europe, they would not have gone somewhere merely distant. They would have gone somewhere unreachable. Antarctica is the ultimate unreachable place. A land that erases footprints. A continent that buries evidence beneath ice that renews itself endlessly. A vault designed by nature itself, which raises a darker, more unsettling possibility. What if Antarctica was not discovered in the modern age, but deliberately forgotten? What if the ice was not a barrier to discovery, but the final layer of concealment? The Templars believed in sacred geometry, that certain places on Earth held power because of their position, their isolation, their alignment with the heavens. They believed knowledge should be preserved, not exploited, hidden, not destroyed, passed forward only when humanity was ready. Antarctica, at the very bottom of the world, beyond trade routes, beyond empires, beyond curiosity itself, would have been the perfect place. And so the question shifts. Not, did the Templars reach Antarctica? But what would force them to go there? Because men do not flee to the end of the world without reason. Something was worth saving. Something worth risking annihilation for. Something that, if found by their enemies, could reshape power, faith, and history itself. As the map rests behind its glass, silent and unassuming, it asks us a question without words. If medieval men knew the shape of a frozen continent centuries before science, if a hunted order vanished with ships, gold, and secrets, and if Antarctica still remains locked, restricted, and strangely untouchable today, then perhaps the greatest secret of the Knights Templar was never buried in Europe at all. Perhaps it sleeps beneath the ice, waiting, across France, across kingdoms that trusted the same sealed orders. Fists struck doors in the darkness. Iron rang against wood. Torches hissed in the cold October air. In monasteries, castles, and commanderies, men who had risen before sunrise their entire lives were pulled from prayer into chaos. It was Friday, October 13th, 1307. The Knights Templar did not know it yet, but by nightfall their world would be broken. For nearly 2 centuries, they had been untouchable. Warrior monks bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet richer than kings. Feared in battle, trusted in finance, protected by papal authority that placed them beyond the reach of any crown. They were not merely an order, they were a system, one that moved men, money, and information with silent efficiency. And systems make enemies. King Philip IV of France had many reasons to fear the Templars. He owed them enormous debts. He resented their independence. And perhaps most dangerously, he suspected they knew things he did not, things that could not be controlled by royal decree. So he planned in silence. Sealed letters were prepared months in advance, carried by trusted couriers, opened only at the final moment. No warning, no negotiation. The arrests were simultaneous, precise, merciless. Even Templar knights hardened by war were stunned by the speed of it. One by one they were seized, shackled, dragged away under accusations so shocking they barely made sense. Spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, secret initiations that mocked Christ himself. To the public it sounded monstrous. To the Templars it sounded rehearsed. Interrogations followed swiftly. And then the torture. Men who had endured the heat of the Levant and the steel of enemy blades found themselves broken on racks, burned, starved, and suffocated. Confessions were extracted like blood from stone. Words were forced into mouths that no longer recognized themselves. And yet, even as the flames rose, something vital remained absent. There were no detailed confessions of treasure. No clear explanation of hidden knowledge. No recovered archives. For an order famous for meticulous records, their silence was deafening. As the arrests spread, something else happened quietly, away from the prisons and pyres. Ships left port. At La Rochelle, the Templars' primary Atlantic harbor, witnesses later claimed the docks were busy in the days before the arrests. Cargo loaded at night. Vessels departing without ceremony. Then suddenly the harbor was empty. When royal officials arrived, expecting to seize the order's legendary wealth, they found locked doors and bare vaults. Gold did not vanish by accident. Nor did fleets. Philip raged. The Pope hesitated. And Europe watched as the once mighty Templars were reduced to prisoners and heretics. But beneath the spectacle of destruction lay an uncomfortable truth. The operation was incomplete. The body was broken. The heart was missing. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, was among those arrested. Dragged from his quarters, humiliated, paraded as a traitor to God. Under torture, he confessed, then recanted, then confessed again. His words shifted, fractured, bent under pain. But never once did he reveal where the order's wealth had gone. Nor did he explain what exactly they were being punished for knowing. Because even in their darkest hour, the Templars followed one final rule. Some things were not meant to be spoken. The trials dragged on for years. The accusations grew stranger. Idol worship involving a mysterious head. Initiations performed in darkness. Kisses exchanged in secret. The stories became increasingly theatrical, designed to horrify the public and justify the purge. But beneath the lurid details, a pattern emerged. The crimes were not about immorality. They were about deviation. Deviation from doctrine, from obedience, from approved knowledge. The Templars were accused not just of sin, but of understanding God differently, of possessing truths that bypassed the Church's authority. In a world built on hierarchy and revelation controlled from the top, that was unforgivable. And so the order was dissolved, its properties seized, its name condemned. Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake in 1314, proclaiming his innocence as flames climbed his robes. Legend says he called down a curse upon the Pope and the King, both of whom would die within the year. History remembers this as an ending. But endings leave remains. And the remains did not add up. Entire groups of knights were never accounted for. Some commanderies reported that their brothers had simply vanished before the arrests. In certain regions, local lords claimed the Templars had already abandoned their holdings. In others, records stopped abruptly mid-sentence, as if the scribes had been interrupted or warned. Most troubling of all was the absence of resistance. The Templars were elite fighters, thousands strong, spread across Europe. Yet they did not rise in revolt. They did not defend themselves with force. They did not rally allies. It was as if they had already accepted the outcome, or prepared for it. This raises a chilling possibility, that the arrests were not a surprise to everyone, that somewhere within the order, a warning had been issued, plan activated, a final instruction passed quietly from mouth to ear. If so, the goal was not survival in Europe. It was preservation elsewhere, because while men were arrested and burned, ideas can travel, knowledge can be moved, and secrets, once scattered, become nearly impossible to destroy. The fall of the Templars was loud, public, and brutal. But whatever they were protecting slipped away in the confusion, not in panic but in design. And so we are left with a haunting contradiction. The most powerful order in medieval Europe was destroyed, yet the evidence suggests they were not caught unprepared. Their enemies seized land, titles, and names, but they never found what they were truly after, which forces a question history prefers not to ask. If the Templars anticipated their own destruction, if they moved their fleet, their knowledge, and their most dangerous secrets beyond reach, then perhaps the purge was not the end of the order. Perhaps it was the moment they disappeared on purpose. And perhaps the map, the one that shows a land at the bottom of the world, is not a clue to their beginning, but to their escape. 9 men, according to tradition, stood in the shadow of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem in the early 12th century. The Crusades had carved open the Holy Land, and pilgrims poured in from Europe, vulnerable on roads haunted by bandits and war. These men called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. They vowed poverty. They vowed obedience. They vowed to protect the faithful, and they asked for nothing in return. At least that is how the story is usually told. In reality, their poverty did not last long. Within decades, the Order of the Temple transformed from a small brotherhood of knights into one of the most formidable institutions in Christendom. Kings donated land. Nobles entrusted them with wealth. The Church itself placed them under direct papal protection, freeing them from taxes, laws, and even local bishops. This was unprecedented. A private army, loyal only to God and the Pope, operating across borders with impunity. The Templars built fortresses that still loom over landscapes today. They refined cavalry tactics that dominated medieval battlefields. Their red cross became a symbol of both salvation and fear. But war was only one side of their power. The Templars understood something that few others did. Trust is the most valuable currency of all. Pilgrims could deposit money with the order in Europe and withdraw it in the Holy Land. In an age without banks, this was revolutionary. They issued letters of credit. They moved vast sums invisibly. They financed kings and wars alike. By the 13th century, the Templars were not just warriors. They were administrators, engineers, financiers, and diplomats. They controlled ports, roads, and fleets. They had eyes and ears everywhere, and knowledge flowed through these networks as freely as gold. In Jerusalem, they were granted quarters on the Temple Mount itself, a place layered with ruins from civilizations long vanished. Beneath their feet lay the remnants of Solomon's temple, Herod's expansions, Roman destruction, and older structures whose origins were already forgotten. For nearly a decade, the early Templars remained strangely inactive militarily. Instead of charging into battle, they stayed close to the temple, excavated, explored, catalogued. Officially, this period is glossed over. Unofficially, it is the moment everything changes. Legends whisper that the Templars discovered something beneath the Temple Mount. Ancient texts, sacred relics, records predating Christianity, perhaps even maps not of kingdoms but of the world itself. Whether literal or symbolic, the impact was profound. After this period, donations surged, influence followed, and the order's trajectory shifted permanently. They were no longer just protectors of pilgrims. They were guardians of something else. The medieval world was not as ignorant as modern stereotypes suggest. Arabic scholars preserved Greek science. Jewish mystics explored numerology and cosmology. Byzantine libraries held fragments of lost worlds. Through war and trade, the Templars came into contact with all of it. They learned geometry not just as math, but as meaning, proportion as theology, architecture as encoded belief. Their churches reflect this, austere on the surface but mathematically precise in ways that still puzzle researchers. They also learned secrecy. Initiation rituals were private. Symbols were layered. Language was coded. A cross was never just a cross. A map was never just a map. Knowledge was divided into levels, revealed only when trust was absolute. This secrecy fueled suspicion. How could monks grow so wealthy while claiming poverty? How could knights answer to no king? How could an order move money and information without oversight? The more powerful they became, the more dangerous they appeared. Yet within the order there was a strict internal discipline. Brothers were punished for vanity. Personal wealth was forbidden. Individual ambition was crushed. Whatever the Templars pursued, it was not personal gain. It was collective purpose. That purpose may have been preservation. The medieval church taught a linear history: creation, fall, redemption, judgment. But older traditions spoke of cycles, ages rising and collapsing, civilizations forgetting themselves, knowledge lost to catastrophe, then rediscovered by chance. If the Templars encountered evidence of such cycles, maps of lands now buried, records of sciences beyond their era, they would have understood the danger. A society not ready for certain truths can tear itself apart. To preserve knowledge sometimes means hiding it. The Templars did not hoard information openly. They embedded it in cathedrals aligned to stars, in symbols repeated across continents, in financial systems that moved resources quietly, in fleets that could travel beyond the familiar edges of the world. Their ships deserve special attention. Unlike most medieval vessels, Templar ships were built for endurance, not just coastal travel. They had access to advanced navigation techniques learned from Islamic sailors. They understood currents and winds. They knew how to move unseen. This matters because knowledge without mobility is a dead end. If the Templars possessed ancient geographic information, knowledge of lands beyond accepted maps, they also possessed the means to reach them, and reach them without drawing attention. This combination of secrecy, mobility, and discipline is what made the order truly unique. They were not reckless explorers chasing glory. They were planners, archivists of reality, men who believed that God's creation was vast, ordered, and comprehensible, but not to everyone at once. Which brings us back to their contradiction. They preached humility, yet wielded immense power. They claimed obedience, yet operated independently. They vowed poverty, yet controlled wealth that dwarfed monarchies. To outsiders, this looked like hypocrisy. To insiders, it may have looked like necessity. Because guarding knowledge in a dangerous world requires resources. Silence requires strength. And survival sometimes demands invisibility. By the time their enemies moved against them, the Templars were no longer just an order of knights. They were a network, a memory system stretching across Europe and beyond. One that could absorb loss, reroute itself, and endure even if its visible structure collapsed. So when the arrests came and the fires burned, the question was never whether the Templars would fall. The question was whether what they carried would fall with them. And if the answer is no, if their knowledge survived, displaced rather than destroyed, then their true legacy is not found in ruined castles or trial transcripts. It is found in the spaces they left behind, in maps that should not exist, in routes that lead away from civilization, and in the possibility that the Order of the Temple was never meant to rule history, only to safeguard it. They were read aloud in courtrooms, whispered in taverns, and repeated from pulpits until they hardened into truth. To the public, they sounded horrifying. To historians, they sounded strangely unfocused. And to the men being accused, they sounded like something else entirely, a carefully constructed weapon. The Knights Templar, once praised as defenders of Christendom, were now charged with crimes so shocking that mercy became unthinkable. They were said to deny Christ during initiation, to spit upon the cross, to worship a mysterious idol, to engage in secret rites that inverted everything the Church held sacred. It was not enough to accuse them of corruption. They were accused of deviation. The most infamous charge centered on an idol, a severed head, sometimes described as bearded, sometimes with multiple faces, sometimes metallic, sometimes flesh. It was called by different names in different confessions. Baphomet, a demon, a false god, something that brought wealth and fertility to the order. The descriptions were wildly inconsistent. Some Templars claimed they had never seen such an object. Others, under torture, described it vaguely. A few repeated exactly what interrogators suggested. The more pain increased, the more elaborate the stories became. This alone should have raised doubt. But doubt was not the goal. Fear was, because an idol is not just a symbol of heresy. It is a challenge to authority. It suggests that truth exists outside approved doctrine, that power does not flow solely through church and crown. Even more disturbing to their accusers were the initiation rites. New members were allegedly blindfolded, led into darkness, commanded to renounce Christ, and subjected to humiliating acts meant to break their faith. To modern ears, this sounds like deliberate blasphemy. But to those familiar with secret societies, it sounds like something else. Symbolic death and rebirth. Rites designed to strip away old identities before revealing new responsibilities. In mystery traditions far older than Christianity, initiations often involved reversal, shock, and taboo, not to reject belief but to deepen it. What appears profane to an outsider can be sacred within context. But context was never allowed, because the true danger was not moral corruption. It was independence of thought. Another accusation claimed the Templars possessed secret knowledge handed down from ancient sources, that they taught their members doctrines known only to the inner circle, that their understanding of God did not align perfectly with church teaching. This was closer to the truth and far more dangerous. The medieval church was not merely a spiritual institution. It was the keeper of history, science, and meaning. To challenge its monopoly on knowledge was to threaten the entire structure of society. Heresy, in this sense, was not about disbelief, it was about alternative belief. The Templars had access to texts most Europeans never saw. Through contact with Islamic scholars, Jewish mystics, and Eastern Christians, they encountered ideas that blurred rigid theological boundaries. Mathematics as sacred language, astronomy as divine order, creation as ongoing process rather than finished event. If these ideas circulated freely, the Church's authority weakened. And so the accusations focused not on what the Templars did publicly, their battles, their banking, their charity, but on what they did privately, what they said in darkness, what they passed from master to initiate, what they refused to write down. Under torture, truth becomes irrelevant. Men will say anything to stop pain. The confessions obtained from the Templars are filled with contradictions. One knight describes a ritual that another denies. Dates and places do not match. Objects appear and disappear. Yet these inconsistencies were ignored, because the outcome was already decided. The trials were not investigations. They were performances. Philip IV needed the order discredited. The Pope needed unity. And Europe needed a villain whose destruction would feel justified. The Templars, secretive and powerful, fit the role perfectly. Still, something strange emerges when we look closer. Despite the brutality, the accusations never fully explain what the Templars supposedly believed instead. There is no coherent alternative theology presented. No clear doctrine of evil. Just fragments, symbols, hints of something unspoken, almost as if the interrogators sensed a truth they could not articulate. Consider the obsession with the head. In many ancient traditions, the head symbolizes wisdom, consciousness, and divine spark. Severed heads appear in Celtic myth, Greek philosophy, and Gnostic imagery, not as objects of worship, but as containers of knowledge. The accusation that the Templars revered a head may have been a distorted echo of something symbolic rather than literal. Perhaps they honored not an idol but an idea, that wisdom survives even when bodies perish, that truth can be separated from institutions, that knowledge, once uncovered, cannot be unlearned. This would explain why the accusations fixated on secrecy, on inner circles, on forbidden transmission. The Templars were not accused of spreading heresy publicly, they were accused of guarding it privately. And guarding knowledge is far more threatening than preaching rebellion. There is also the matter of what was never accused. The Templars were not charged with treason, not officially, not with plotting against kings, not with raising armies. Their supposed crimes were spiritual, not political. Yet the response was total annihilation. This imbalance suggests that the real fear lay elsewhere. If the order had merely been corrupt, reform would have sufficed. If they had been immoral, punishment would have ended it. But if they possessed knowledge that challenged foundational beliefs, knowledge that could not be taken back once revealed, then destruction became the only option. Burn the men, scatter the order, silence the symbols. And yet, symbols have a way of surviving. The trials failed to produce the one thing Philip truly needed: proof. No recovered texts, no revealed doctrines, no physical idols presented to the public. Everything rested on coerced testimony and rumor, which raises a final, unsettling thought. What if the accusations were not meant to expose the Templars' secrets, but to distract from them? To keep attention focused on scandal and sin, while something far more significant slipped quietly away, while fleets vanished, while knowledge changed hands, while the true inheritance of the order was relocated beyond reach. Because in the end, the charges tell us less about what the Templars believed and more about what their enemies feared. Not that the Templars had abandoned God, but that they had learned something about the world that could not be controlled, and that, in any age, is the most unforgivable crime of all. When the fires burned out and the prisons emptied, Europe expected closure. The Knights Templar had been declared heretics. Their order was dissolved. Their properties were seized or reassigned. Their leaders were dead. On parchment, the problem was solved. In reality, the problem had only deepened, because the disappearance did not match the destruction. For an organization famous for its structure, discipline, and documentation, the final accounting made no sense. Records stopped abruptly. Inventories were incomplete. Entire groups of men were simply unaccounted for. And most troubling of all, the wealth and resources that had made the Templars so powerful were nowhere to be found. This was not a matter of poor bookkeeping. It was absence on a scale that demanded explanation. Royal agents scoured commanderies expecting to find vaults filled with gold and silver. They found empty rooms, churches stripped of ornament, strongholds abandoned in haste but not panic. It was as if someone had arrived before them with a list and time to spare. At La Rochelle, the Order's primary Atlantic port, the mystery grew sharper. The Templars controlled the harbor for decades. They maintained a fleet there, ships capable of long voyages, not merely coastal trade. Yet when officials arrived to seize these vessels, the docks were bare. No wrecks, no signs of forced departure, just gone. Contemporary chroniclers noted the silence with confusion. Some whispered that the ships had sailed days before the arrests. Others claimed they departed under cover of darkness. A few suggested they never returned from a final voyage whose destination was never recorded. What matters is not which version is correct. What matters is that the fleet vanished completely. And fleets do not vanish by accident. Across Europe, similar patterns emerged. In England, Scotland, Portugal, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, Templars seemed to melt away. Some were arrested. Many were not. Local rulers reported that brothers had already left their houses. In some regions, the order's dissolution occurred with little resistance and even less drama, as if the ending had been expected. The church tried to absorb what remained. Some knights joined other orders. Some retired quietly. But these explanations account for only a fraction of the missing. The rest disappear from the historical record. No death certificates. No trials. No graves. This silence has fueled centuries of speculation. Treasure hidden in caves. Gold buried beneath ruined castles. Wealth sunk in lakes. These stories are comforting because they are simple. But they are also wrong. The Templars were not hoarders of treasure. They were managers of systems. Their wealth was mobile, abstract, and often intangible. Letters of credit, promises, knowledge of routes and alliances, and knowledge, unlike gold, cannot be seized unless it is found. Which brings us to the most unsettling possibility. What if the disappearance was not chaotic? What if it was coordinated? To believe this, we must accept that the Templars anticipated their downfall. That warnings traveled faster than royal orders. That some within the order understood the political winds long before the arrests began. There is evidence to suggest exactly that. Philip IV's hostility toward the Templars was no secret. His debts were public. His conflicts with the papacy were escalating. His need for control was obvious. The idea that an order as informed as the Templars would be unaware of this danger stretches credibility. They had spies, informants, financial ties that reached into royal courts. They read the world as carefully as they read scripture. If the warning came, it would not have been shouted. It would have been whispered. A message passed through trusted channels. A signal understood only by those trained to listen. Instructions not written down but memorized. What to move, what to destroy, what to abandon, and most importantly, where to go. Because survival requires destination. Scattered men without refuge would be hunted down. But men moving along prepared routes, toward safe havens beyond political reach, could disappear almost completely. Some historians point to Portugal, where the Templars were rebranded rather than destroyed. Others look to Scotland, where King Robert the Bruce was already excommunicated and had little reason to obey papal orders. These places explain some survivors, but they do not explain the scale, nor do they explain the ships. A fleet implies movement beyond land borders, beyond jurisdictions, beyond the familiar world. The Atlantic in the early 14th century was not empty, nor was it fully known. It was a threshold, dangerous, unpredictable, and therefore useful to those who wished to vanish. Medieval sailors already reached the Azores, Madeira, and Canary Islands. Norse voyages to North America were not forgotten legends. They were fragments of memory. Currents flowed reliably west and south. Winds could be learned, and the Templars, with their resources and discipline, were uniquely positioned to exploit this. If they carried something that could not fall into hostile hands, texts, maps, or knowledge that threatened powerful institutions, then hiding it on land would never be enough. Borders shift, empires fall, secrecy erodes. Only isolation endures. The disappearance of the Templars, then, begins to resemble not collapse, but transformation. The shedding of a public identity to preserve a deeper mission. The abandonment of Europe as a stage that had become too dangerous. This reframes the trials themselves. While kings and crowds focused on accusations and executions, something else unfolded quietly elsewhere. Ships moved. Knowledge moved. Men who were officially dead or disgraced stepped into anonymity. The destruction was real. People suffered. Lives were lost. But the core of the order, its purpose, whatever it truly was, may have slipped through the cracks. And history, written by those who remained, simply labeled the absence as failure. But absence can be intentional. The Templars were trained to think in long arcs. They understood that survival is not always immediate. Sometimes it requires waiting generations. Sometimes it requires erasing oneself from memory. Which leads us to the most disturbing implication of all. If the order truly vanished by design, if its fleet sailed beyond known maps, if its most guarded knowledge was relocated rather than destroyed, then the real legacy of the Knights Templar is not something lost in the past. It is something hidden. Hidden so well that even history itself forgot where to look. And perhaps that was always the plan. To understand where the Templars could have gone, we must first understand how medieval people imagined the world. It is easy to assume that the Middle Ages were defined by ignorance, by crude maps and fearful minds that believed the earth ended at the edge of the sea. That picture is comforting, because it reassures us that the past was simple. But it is also false. Medieval scholars knew the world was round. They calculated its circumference with surprising accuracy. They tracked stars, seasons, and tides. What they lacked was not intelligence, but permission. Permission to explore freely. Permission to record certain ideas openly. Permission to challenge inherited boundaries. Maps of the medieval world were not designed to show everything that existed. They were designed to show what was acceptable. The famous Mappa Mundi placed Jerusalem at the center. East was often at the top, not north. The edges of these maps were filled with monsters, marvels, and warnings. Not because people believed them literally, but because the margins represented uncertainty. The unknown was symbolic, not empty. Beyond the edges lay possibility. And for groups with knowledge to protect, the margins were the safest place to operate. Ancient geographers had already proposed the existence of a vast southern land. The idea of Terra Australis, a balancing continent at the bottom of the world, circulated long before Antarctica was officially discovered. Philosophers reasoned that the Earth must be symmetrical. Land in the north required land in the south. This was theory, not fantasy. And theories matter when they are combined with inherited maps. The Templars did not rely solely on Latin Christian sources. Through the Crusades, they encountered Islamic cartographers whose work preserved and expanded upon Greek knowledge. Scholars like Al-Idrisi produced remarkably accurate world maps in the 12th century, drawing coastlines and climates with a precision Europe would not match for centuries. These maps did not stop at Europe's comfort zone. They reached deep into Africa, across Asia, toward southern oceans that few Europeans dared to imagine. Knowledge flowed along trade routes, and the Templars stood at the crossroads of those routes. They protected caravans, controlled ports, negotiated with cultures that understood the sea as a highway, not a boundary. They learned what winds returned ships home. They learned where currents carried vessels without effort. They learned which routes were watched, and which were ignored. In medieval thought, the end of the world was not always a literal edge. It was a conceptual boundary, a place beyond law, beyond kings, beyond theology. To cross it was to step outside history. This made it ideal, because a secret does not need to be hidden where no one can reach it. It needs to be hidden where no one is looking. Consider the psychology of exploration. People search where they expect something to be found. They follow familiar narratives. They rarely seek what contradicts their assumptions. In the 14th century, no one expected anyone to go south. Exploration pointed east, toward Asia and its riches, west, toward uncertain trade, but south, toward cold, storm, and emptiness, offered no reward, unless reward was not the goal. The Templars understood symbolism as deeply as strategy. They believed geography carried meaning. Jerusalem was sacred because of what it represented. So was the Temple Mount. So were deserts, mountains, and islands. The far south represented separation, finality, the end of cycles. If one wished to remove something from the flow of history, not to destroy it, but to preserve it untouched, the symbolic end of the world was the perfect choice. This is where maps become more than navigation tools. They become expressions of intent. Certain medieval maps include curious distortions near their southern edges. Coastlines that do not belong to Africa or Asia. Lands drawn faintly without names. Notes written in ambiguous Latin. Warnings that say nothing and everything at once. Most scholars dismiss these as artistic flourishes. But what if they are placeholders? What if they mark knowledge that could not be openly declared? The Templars would have understood how to encode information this way. They used symbols constantly, not to deceive but to limit access. A symbol does not reveal itself unless the viewer knows how to read it. This applies not only to maps, but to routes. Sailing beyond known waters was not impossible in the Middle Ages. It was discouraged. Ships were capable. Sailors were skilled. What was missing was institutional support. Kings wanted returns on investment. Merchants wanted profit. The church wanted control. But the Templars answered to none of these pressures. They could afford to fail quietly. They could afford to disappear. The idea that medieval ships could not survive southern oceans is another comforting myth. Storms are not exclusive to the south. The Atlantic was already brutal. Sailors adapted. They learned to read swells, winds, and stars. And the farther one went from trade routes, the safer one became from interference. This reframes the meaning of beyond the known world. It does not mean sailing blindly into chaos. It means choosing a direction that civilization had no interest in following. If the Templars carried something that needed to remain untouched for centuries, they would not have left clues that could be easily decoded. They would have relied on assumption, the assumption that no one would ever think to look there. And for centuries, no one did. Antarctica did not enter official maps until the modern era. Even then, it was dismissed as ice and rock, a scientific curiosity, not a historical one. The idea that medieval men might have known of its existence was laughed away, which is exactly what makes it effective as a hiding place. Because the most powerful concealment is not secrecy. It is disbelief. If you tell someone the truth but frame it as impossible, it becomes invisible. This is why the concept of the end of the world matters so deeply to this story. It was not a fixed location. It was a mental boundary, one that could be exploited by those willing to think differently. The Templars thought in terms of centuries, not lifetimes. They did not need recognition. They did not need validation. They needed continuity. And continuity sometimes requires stepping so far outside history that history forgets you were ever there. So when we ask where the Templars went, the answer may not be a place we can easily point to on a map. It may be a direction chosen precisely because it led beyond expectation, beyond pursuit, beyond belief. and toward a silence deep enough to protect whatever truth they carried, until the world was ready to ask the right questions. When the Knights Templar were erased from most of Europe, one small kingdom behaved very differently. Portugal did not burn its Templars. It did not imprison them en masse. It did not stage public confessions or theatrical trials. Instead, something quieter and far more revealing took place. The order was renamed. In 1319, barely 12 years after the mass arrests began, the Portuguese crown created a new institution, the Order of Christ. On paper, it was a fresh beginning, loyal to the king and approved by the Pope. In reality, it was a continuation. The same knights, the same properties, the same symbols slightly altered, but unmistakable. Where other rulers saw danger, Portugal saw opportunity. King Dinis understood something that Philip of France did not. The Templars were not just warriors or bankers. They were infrastructure. They were expertise. And more importantly, they were a gateway to something larger than land wars and political intrigue. They were a maritime force. Portugal faced the Atlantic. Its future did not lie in expanding east into crowded European territories, but outward into the sea. Exploration was not a romantic dream yet. It was a necessity. And no group in the kingdom understood logistics, navigation, and secrecy better than the former Templars. By protecting them, Dinis inherited more than men. He inherited knowledge. The Order of Christ retained Templar discipline and internal hierarchy. Their Red Cross changed form but not meaning. Their fortresses became naval hubs. Their resources were redirected from crusades to ships. And then, something extraordinary happened. Within a century, Portugal launched the Age of Discovery. Prince Henry the Navigator, himself Grand Master of the Order of Christ, oversaw voyages that pushed steadily down the African coast. Cape after cape fell behind them. What was once considered impassable became routine. Navigation techniques improved rapidly. Ship design evolved with startling speed. This acceleration was not accidental. It was built on inherited foundations. The Order of Christ financed expeditions that made no immediate profit. They supported journeys whose value lay in information rather than trade. They sent men to places no one else cared about: coastlines, currents, winds, and stars. Knowledge first, wealth later. This is precisely how the Templars had always operated. Maps from this period show sudden expansions of the known world, often with details that appear too refined for first-time exploration. Coastal outlines are clean. Harbors are marked with confidence. Hazards are noted as if already familiar. Portugal seemed to know where it was going before it went there. This has long puzzled historians. The official explanation credits innovation, courage, and trial and error. But trial and error leaves scars. Shipwrecks, lost decades, dead ends. Portugal's expansion was efficient, which suggests preparation. The former Templars provided continuity across generations. While kings changed and wars flared, the Order of Christ maintained long-term vision. They preserved records, trained navigators, passed down techniques quietly, and perhaps most importantly, they knew what not to share. Exploration thrives on selective disclosure. You publish discoveries when it benefits you. You hide routes when they are too valuable. You let rivals believe you are guessing when you are following inherited lines. This strategy echoes something older. The Templars had always functioned this way, appearing pious and obedient on the surface, while operating according to deeper internal priorities. In Portugal, for the first time, they were allowed to do so openly under royal protection. This makes Portugal a crucial bridge in the story, because it shows that the Templars did not simply vanish. They adapted. They shed their most dangerous identity while preserving their core mission. They traded crusades for caravels, swords for sextants. But the mindset remained the same: guardianship, which leads to an uncomfortable thought. If the Templars were willing to preserve knowledge by embedding themselves within another institution, if they could wait generations for their work to bear fruit, then disappearance elsewhere does not mean extinction. It means relocation. Portugal may have been the visible refuge, the one history remembers, but visible refuges attract attention. They are subject to politics, wars, and record-keeping. If something needed to be hidden permanently, Portugal was not the final destination. It was the staging ground. Ships sailed from Portuguese ports carrying explorers whose names fill textbooks. But they also carried unnamed men. Anonymous crew. Specialists who did not seek fame. They carried charts that were never copied. Instructions that were never written down. And possibly destinations that were never recorded. The Order of Christ operated at the edge of what Europe acknowledged. Their voyages were framed as exploration, but exploration is simply movement with a story attached. What matters is where the story stops. Portuguese maps from the 15th century include strange omissions and distortions in the far south. Coastlines fade. Names vanish. Space is left intentionally blank. Not unknown, blank. Blank space on a map is a decision. It invites some minds forward and warns others away. If the Templars had chosen to move their most guarded knowledge beyond Europe, Portugal provided the tools to do so without suspicion. Ships, expertise, legitimacy, time. Time enough for routes to become traditions, for secrets to be passed down as routine, for extraordinary destinations to become unremarkable through repetition. By the time the wider world realized how far Portugal had gone, the foundations were already centuries old. And if one wished to go farther still, beyond trade winds, beyond familiar latitudes, beyond curiosity itself, there would have been no better launching point. Portugal did not just survive the fall of the Templars. It inherited their future. And that future, shaped by patience and silence, did not stop at Africa. It did not stop at the equator, and it may not have stopped at the edge of any map that history is comfortable admitting. Ships had to be capable of the journey. This is where the story of the Templars becomes especially uncomfortable for modern assumptions, because medieval technology was not as fragile as we like to imagine. The idea that ships of the 13th and 14th centuries were incapable of long-distance or southern voyages is a myth built from underestimation rather than evidence. The Templars were not ordinary ship owners. They controlled ports. They financed construction. They employed sailors who learned their craft not from theory, but from repetition and risk. Their fleets were designed for reliability, not spectacle, for cargo and endurance, not coastal convenience. Unlike merchant ships built to hop from harbor to harbor, Templar vessels were constructed with long horizons in mind. Stronger hulls, reinforced keels, higher freeboards to survive heavy seas. These were not luxuries. They were necessities for any group that expected to operate beyond the Mediterranean's relative calm. More importantly, the Templars did not rely solely on European shipbuilding traditions. Through their presence in the Levant, they absorbed Islamic naval knowledge. Lateen sails allowed vessels to tack against the wind. Stern-mounted rudders improved maneuverability. Star navigation techniques refined by Arab astronomers expanded what was possible at sea. This fusion of technologies quietly gave them an advantage that most European fleets lacked. They could sail when others would not. Navigation itself was treated as sacred knowledge. Mariners memorized star paths, not just names. They understood seasonal winds not as superstition, but as patterns. The Templars valued this knowledge highly, passing it down through trusted lines rather than public manuals. A sailor trained in these traditions did not need a map for every journey. He needed confidence. And confidence is what allows a ship to leave sight of land without fear. If the Templars anticipated disappearance, they would not have chosen fragile vessels or untested crews. They would have prepared quietly over years. Ships refitted under mundane pretenses. Cargo holds modified. Supplies gathered without urgency. When the moment came, the departure would not have looked dramatic. It would have looked routine. The Atlantic, often described as a medieval barrier, was in fact a conveyor. Currents like the Canary Current and the South Equatorial Current could carry ships vast distances with minimal effort. Knowledge of these flows was guarded carefully by those who possessed it. Once you understand a current, the ocean stops being random. It becomes directional. And direction matters when you want to go somewhere no one else does. Templar ships did not need to race. They did not need to explore every coastline. They could follow established paths known only within their circles. Paths inherited from older traditions. Paths perhaps recorded in maps that were never meant to survive publicly. This brings us to the most important distinction. Explorers seek discovery. Custodians seek destinations. The Templars were custodians. They did not sail to be remembered. They sailed because something required relocation. Something that could not remain where it was. This changes how we interpret their disappearance. It was not a desperate flight. It was an execution of plan. And plans require rehearsal. Evidence of advanced maritime knowledge appears repeatedly in later centuries, often without clear origin. The sudden emergence of accurate coastal maps. The rapid improvement of ship design. The ability of certain orders and nations to move confidently into open waters. These developments did not appear spontaneously. They were inherited. If Templar fleets vanished, they did so along routes already tested. Routes that left no trace because no one was meant to follow them. Routes that led not toward trade but toward isolation. Isolation is not emptiness. It is control. The farther a ship travels from familiar waters, the less likely it is to be intercepted, recorded, or remembered. Names fade. Logs are lost. Voyages without witnesses become rumors at best. This is how one erases movement from history. And if the destination lies beyond the world's psychological boundaries, beyond what people believe possible, then even rumors die quickly. There is also the matter of intent. The Templars did not seek a place to rebuild power. They sought a place where power was irrelevant. A location that would never attract settlement. Never inspire conquest. Never invite curiosity until a distant future. Which raises a troubling question. Why go to such extremes? Because what they carried may not have been safe anywhere else. Not gold, not relics, but information that, if misused, could destabilize belief systems and hierarchies across civilizations. Knowledge of past ages, of forgotten lands, of cycles humanity was not meant to remember yet. Such knowledge cannot be destroyed once uncovered, can only be delayed. Ships are tools of delay. They move knowledge beyond reach, buying time measured not in years, but in centuries. And ships built by the Templars were capable of this role. They were strong enough to endure long passages, skilled enough to navigate without landmarks, discreet enough to vanish without witnesses, which means the question is no longer whether medieval ships could make such journeys. The question becomes far more unsettling. Where would you take something that must remain hidden for as long as possible? Not into another kingdom, not into another faith, not even into legend, but into a place so inhospitable, so remote, so unimaginable, that no one would think to look there at all. A destination where ships are not expected to return, and where, once unloaded, history itself would freeze around whatever was left behind. Because when the sea forgets you, and the ice seals the land, disappearance becomes permanent. And permanence was always the Templars' greatest skill. If the Templars carried something worth moving beyond the known world, we must ask what kind of knowledge could justify such an effort. Not gold, not relics, not power in the ordinary sense. Those things can be seized, spent, or reclaimed. They lose meaning with time. The effort to protect them for centuries would make little sense. What endures and what terrifies institutions is understanding. The Templars lived at a crossroads of civilizations. Through the Crusades, they encountered Islamic scholars who preserved Greek science when Europe forgot it. Through Jewish communities, they encountered mystical traditions that treated numbers, letters, and geometry as keys to reality. Through Eastern Christianity, they encountered cosmologies that differed subtly, but profoundly, from Rome's teachings. This exposure did not weaken their faith, complicated it. They began to see creation not as a static event, but as a layered process. History not as a straight line, but as a cycle. Humanity not as the center of the universe, but as a participant within it. Such ideas were not heretical in themselves, until they were spoken openly. The Church depended on a singular narrative. Creation, fall, redemption, judgment, linear, final, controlled. Anything that suggested repetition, forgotten ages, or lost civilizations threatened this framework. And yet, ancient texts suggested exactly that. Plato wrote of Atlantis, a civilization destroyed by catastrophe, erased almost entirely. Hesiod spoke of ages of man. Hindu traditions described vast cycles of creation and destruction. Mesoamerican myths echoed similar themes across oceans no medieval European was supposed to understand. These parallels are not coincidences. They are fragments of a shared human memory. The Templars, with access to texts and travelers from across the known world, were uniquely positioned to notice these connections. They could compare stories, align timelines, ask questions others never could. What if the world had ended before? What if knowledge had been lost? Not once, but many times. And what if remnants of that knowledge survived in places untouched by catastrophe? Maps are the most dangerous form of knowledge because they make the invisible concrete. A map does not speculate. It asserts. To possess a map of a place others believe does not exist is to challenge their understanding of reality itself. Some medieval maps hint at knowledge that should not have been available. Not just coastlines, but accurate proportions. Latitudes that match modern measurements. Details that suggest direct observation rather than hearsay. Such maps are often dismissed as errors or coincidences. But coincidence becomes unlikely when accuracy repeats. The idea that Antarctica was once ice-free is not fantasy. Geological evidence suggests that millions of years ago, it supported rivers, forests, and life. But what unsettles scholars is not the ice-free past itself. It is the implication that someone might have seen it. If ancient civilizations existed during a period when Antarctica was temperate, or if they possessed technology capable of penetrating ice long before modern science, then maps of that land could have been created, copied, and preserved. Knowledge can outlive civilizations if it is hidden well enough. The Templars may not have created this knowledge. They may have inherited it. In Jerusalem, beneath layers of sacred construction, lay ruins from eras barely understood. Archives from Byzantium held texts rescued from Rome's fall. Islamic libraries preserved works Europe forgot. Each conquest scattered information but also redistributed it. The Templars, stationed at the convergence of these streams, could have gathered fragments and assembled a larger picture. A picture that suggested humanity's story was incomplete. This kind of understanding changes everything. It reframes progress as recovery, discovery as remembrance. It suggests that modern civilization is not the first to reach advanced knowledge, only the latest. Such an idea undermines authority. If truth is cyclical, institutions lose their claim to permanence. If civilizations rise and fall repeatedly, then power becomes temporary. If knowledge can be lost, then preservation becomes a sacred duty. The Templars may have seen themselves as stewards rather than owners. Their secrecy makes sense in this context. Not because they were plotting domination, but because revelation without readiness leads to destruction. History itself offers examples. Libraries burned, scholars killed, ideas erased. To protect knowledge, one must sometimes remove it from circulation. Antarctica, or a similarly unreachable place, would represent the ultimate archive. A natural vault. A location where temperature, isolation, and hostility to human presence combine to prevent casual discovery. Ice is the perfect guardian. Preserves, conceals, deters. But knowledge placed there must first be known to exist. This returns us to the uncomfortable question of maps. Maps do not appear spontaneously. They are copied, corrected, and refined across generations. A map showing Antarctica without ice implies a source map, and perhaps many before it. If the Templars possessed such a lineage of cartographic knowledge, they would have understood its value and its danger. They would also have understood that knowledge alone is not enough. Context matters. A map of an ice-free continent means nothing without understanding when it was ice-free, who lived there, why it changed, and whether it could change again. This is where theology and science intersect. Medieval thinkers were not opposed to catastrophe theory. Flood myths were universal. The Bible itself describes a world reset by water. If such events occurred once, they could occur again. The Templars may have believed they were living in a fragile window of stability. Preserving knowledge for the next cycle may have seemed more important than using it in the current one. This would explain why they did not exploit their knowledge for conquest or dominance, why they chose patience over power, why they accepted destruction rather than compromise their silence. Because once knowledge is released prematurely, it cannot be taken back. Better to be forgotten than to be responsible for misuse. This casts the Templars not as conspirators, but as archivists. Men who understood that the greatest threat to humanity is not ignorance, but knowledge without wisdom. If Antarctica appears in their story, it is not as a destination of ambition. It is a destination of restraint, a place chosen not because it offers opportunity, but because it denies it. And in that denial, it protects something meant to outlast empires. Something that may still be waiting beneath ice and time, for a world capable of understanding what was once hidden, and why it had to be. The idea sounds like heresy against common sense. Antarctica, the coldest, most hostile place on Earth, once warm, green, and alive. For centuries, this notion belonged to myth, not science. But slowly, quietly, the evidence accumulated. And with each discovery, the ground beneath our certainty began to crack. Ice cores drilled deep into Antarctica reveal something extraordinary. Layer by layer, they preserve a climate record stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Trapped air bubbles contain the breath of ancient atmospheres. Isotopes record temperature swings with unforgiving precision. And those records tell a story that refuses to stay buried. Antarctica was not always ice. There were periods, long ones, when parts of the continent supported rivers, forests, and complex ecosystems. Fossilized pollen from temperate plants has been found beneath the ice. Evidence of flowing water carved into bedrock lies hidden under kilometers of frozen mass. This is not speculation. It is geology. The unsettling question is not whether Antarctica was once ice-free. It is when and who might have seen it. Mainstream science places the last fully ice-free period millions of years ago, long before humans. But science also acknowledges that Antarctica's ice sheet has fluctuated dramatically. Portions of the continent may have been ice-free much more recently, tens of thousands of years ago, during periods of rapid climate instability. Human history during that time is largely a blank. Civilizations older than Mesopotamia are no longer dismissed outright. Evidence of advanced societies predating the last ice age is growing slowly, controversially, but persistently. Sites like Göbekli Tepe have already forced a rewrite of timelines once considered unshakable. If humanity is older and more complex than we believed, then the possibility of ancient exploration becomes less absurd. And maps become more troubling. Certain historical maps depict southern landmasses with features that align suspiciously well with modern subglacial surveys of Antarctica. Coastlines match where rock meets sea, not where ice currently exists. Mountain ranges appear where radar later confirmed them beneath the ice. This level of accuracy suggests observation, not imagination. Critics argue coincidence, artistic distortion, wishful interpretation. But coincidence does not explain repeated alignment across different maps, from different regions, created centuries apart. Something was being copied, and copying requires an original. If that original map came from a time when Antarctica was partially ice-free, then it implies survival of knowledge across catastrophic transitions. Knowledge passed from civilization to civilization, hidden in fragments, reinterpreted and protected. This is where the Templars re-enter the story. They lived at a moment when ancient knowledge resurfaced. Greek texts returned to Europe through Arabic translation. Mathematical systems reappeared. Star charts once thought lost were suddenly accessible. The Templars did not need to invent anything. They only needed to recognize significance. A map showing an ice-free southern continent would not have been understood as Antarctica in the modern sense. It would have been understood as evidence of a forgotten world, a time before the world as they knew it. Such a map would not merely challenge geography. It would challenge theology. If the world had undergone cycles of destruction and renewal, then the biblical flood was not a unique event. If civilizations rose and fell long before recorded history, then humanity's story was not singular. These ideas were not heretical because they contradicted faith. They were heretical because they expanded it beyond control. The Church could incorporate allegory, but not repetition. Could accept mystery, but not precedent. To suggest that God had allowed multiple worlds to rise and fall raised dangerous questions. Why were they destroyed? What did they know? And could it happen again? The ice becomes symbolic here. Ice erases. Ice preserves. Ice resets. An ice age is not just a climate event. It is a civilizational eraser. Coastlines vanish. Cities drown. Knowledge scatters. If the Templars encountered evidence that such events were cyclical, and that Antarctica played a role as both refuge and record, then hiding that knowledge becomes an act of responsibility. This reframes Antarctica not as a random landmass, but as a witness, a place that outlives civilizations. And if ancient people reached it, they would not have seen ice. They would have seen rivers flowing south, mountains exposed, a land remote but not uninhabitable. The psychological shock of this idea is profound. It suggests that the world we inhabit is not the first version, that our maps are not the first, that our ignorance is not natural but inherited. The Templars may have understood this in fragments. They may not have known the full story, only enough to recognize danger, enough to understand that some knowledge must wait. Modern science, inching forward, now brushes against the same edge. Radar surveys detect anomalies beneath the ice, structures too geometric, patterns too regular. Most are explained away as natural, and many probably are. But explanation does not equal certainty. The ice is thick. Verification is difficult. And history has a habit of being wrong longer than it should be. What matters is not proof, but possibility. Possibility that Antarctica once held life. Possibility that someone saw it. Possibility that knowledge of that world survived. If that knowledge existed in the medieval period, fragmented, misunderstood, but undeniably real, then the Templars would have recognized its significance instantly. They were men trained to think beyond immediate reward, to serve future generations they would never meet, to preserve faith not as doctrine, but as continuity. Hiding such knowledge would not have felt like deception. It would have felt like stewardship, because knowledge of past collapses forces uncomfortable reflection. It asks whether our own civilization is temporary, whether progress guarantees survival, whether ice could return, metaphorically or literally, to erase us again. Perhaps that is why the idea of an ice-free Antarctica feels so unsettling. It does not just change the past. It threatens the future. And if someone once chose to hide that truth at the far end of the world, beneath layers of ice and silence, they may have done so not out of fear, but out of mercy. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis compiled a map that would not attract much attention for centuries. It was drawn on gazelle skin, pieced together from older sources, and meant primarily as a practical navigation tool. At the time, it showed coastlines of the Atlantic world that were still being explored. Nothing about that alone was unusual. What would become unusual was what the map seemed to remember. Only a fragment of the original survives today, but that fragment is enough to disturb comfortable explanations. Alongside recognizable outlines of Europe, Africa, and South America appears a southern landmass that does not belong there, at least not according to the official timeline of discovery. The coastline is detailed. Bays curve naturally. Mountain ranges are indicated. And most unsettling of all, the land appears free of ice. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as an extension of South America drawn incorrectly. Cartographic error. An artistic flourish. But as mapping technology advanced, comparisons became unavoidable. When scientists began using seismic surveys to peer beneath Antarctica's ice, the shapes revealed beneath the frozen surface began to resemble the shapes on Piri Reis's map. Not vaguely, uncomfortably well. The match is not perfect, no ancient map ever is, but the correspondence is close enough to force a question that has no easy answer. How could a 16th century map depict a coastline that would not be visible until the invention of radar and satellite imaging? Pyre Rees himself left a clue. In notes written on the map, he explained that it was compiled from older sources. Some were Portuguese, some were Arab, and some, he claimed, were very ancient maps drawn in the time of Alexander the Great. This statement is usually brushed aside as exaggeration, but it should not be dismissed so easily. Cartography is cumulative. Each map builds on previous ones. Errors persist, but so do truths. A coastline once observed does not vanish from memory unless it is deliberately erased or forgotten. If Pyre Rees inherited fragments of much older geographic knowledge, then the mystery does not belong to the 16th century alone. It reaches far deeper. The most disturbing aspect of the map is not simply that it shows Antarctica, but how it shows it. The coastline corresponds more closely to the continent's subglacial topography than to its modern ice-covered outline. This implies knowledge of the land beneath the ice, not just the ice itself. There are only 3 explanations for this. The first is coincidence, that random errors happen to align with modern data. This explanation collapses when alignment repeats. The second is advanced technology, that someone long ago possessed methods comparable to modern surveying. This is dismissed because it threatens accepted history. The third is inheritance, that knowledge from a much older time was preserved, copied, and misunderstood by later generations who no longer remembered its origin. The third explanation is the least dramatic, and often the most dangerous, because it suggests continuity where we expect rupture. If ancient civilizations reached levels of geographic understanding we have only recently regained, then history is not a ladder. It is a spiral. This is where the Templars quietly re-enter the picture. The Pyre Rees map did not emerge in isolation. It belongs to a family of maps that include the Orontius Phineas map of 1531 and others that depict a southern continent with surprising confidence. These maps circulate in a world still digesting the collapse of medieval orders and the rebirth of classical knowledge. The Templars, though officially dissolved, were part of that transmission chain. Their disappearance did not erase the knowledge they touched. It displaced it, passed into other hands, other cultures, other archives. Ottoman scholars had access to libraries Europe lost. Islamic civilization preserved texts through centuries of upheaval. Jewish scholars moved knowledge across borders when persecution demanded flight. The Templars interacted with all of these worlds. They did not need to create the map. They only needed to recognize its value and to understand its danger. A map showing an ice-free Antarctica is not merely geographical curiosity. It implies a world before ice, a climate different from ours, and possibly a humanity that lived through that change. Such implications unravel neat timelines. They suggest that catastrophe, not progress, is the dominant rhythm of history. The Church, emerging from the trauma of the Black Death and political fragmentation, had no appetite for such ideas. Neither did monarchies struggling to justify divine right. A forgotten world undermines claims of final authority. The Pyre Rees map survived because it was misunderstood. To its compiler, it was simply practical. A useful chart pieced together from whatever sources were available. The deeper implication, that it preserved a memory of a lost world, was not his concern. But to someone trained in symbolism and long-term thinking, it would have been unmistakable. The Templars believed knowledge could be dangerous if revealed too soon. They understood that timing mattered, that humanity must encounter truth gradually, or not at all. This explains why such maps appear fragmented, partial, and contradictory. They were never meant to explain themselves. They were meant to survive, to wait. When modern scholars argue endlessly over whether the Pyre Rees map shows Antarctica or not, they miss the more important point. The map exists. It carries information that should not have been available. And it belongs to a tradition of knowledge that resisted erasure. This resistance is subtle. No proclamations, no manifestos, no declarations of lost civilizations. Just lines on parchment, curves remembered across centuries, shapes that refuse to disappear. The map does not scream its secret. It whispers, and whispers are harder to silence. If the Templars encountered such material, and there is every reason to believe they did, then their reaction would not have been to publish it. Publication invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites suppression. Instead, they would have protected the chain of transmission, ensured that fragments survived in multiple places, that no single destruction could erase everything. This strategy mirrors their financial systems. Distributed, redundant, resilient. The Pyre Reese map may be one surviving echo of that strategy. Not proof in itself, but evidence of continuity. And continuity is what terrifies rigid histories, because it suggests that even when institutions fall, knowledge flows on, quietly, patiently, waiting for a moment when someone finally asks the right question. The map forces that question upon us. Not, is it accurate? But, what did someone once know that we forgot? And perhaps more unsettling still, what else was hidden, not because it was false, but because it was too true to be spoken aloud? When knowledge must survive persecution, when ideas cannot be spoken aloud without consequence, symbols become vessels. They compress meaning. They disguise intent. They pass truths quietly from one mind to another, across generations, without ever announcing themselves as dangerous. The Knights Templar understood this better than most. Their world was built on symbols: the red cross, the seal of two knights on one horse, the geometry of their churches, the careful alignment of sacred spaces. None of these were decorative. Each carried layered meaning, readable only by those taught how to look. And symbols, unlike words, travel well. They cross borders. They survive translation. They endure when texts are burned. This matters when we turn our attention far from Europe, far from cathedrals and crusader castles, toward places where no medieval knight should have left a trace at all. And yet, traces are whispered about. Reports of cross-like markings carved into stone in remote regions. Architectural alignments that echo Templar geometry. Symbols resembling the equal-armed cross appearing where no Christian presence was officially recorded. Most of these claims are controversial. Some are exaggerated. Some are misunderstood. But not all of them can be dismissed so easily. What is striking is not any single symbol. It is the pattern of symbolism appearing at the margins of the world. The Templars did not mark territory the way empires did. They did not raise flags or monuments announcing conquest. Their symbols were subtle, often small, sometimes deliberately ambiguous. A carving that could be dismissed as coincidence. A geometric alignment only visible from above. A cross that could belong to no nation. This ambiguity was intentional, because symbols were not meant to announce presence. They were meant to confirm it to those who already knew. In medieval thought, geography itself carried symbolic meaning. Certain places were liminal thresholds between worlds. Mountains, deserts, islands, ends of land. These were places where heaven and earth were believed to touch, where revelation was possible. Antarctica, though unknown by name, fits this category perfectly. It is the ultimate liminal place, the edge of habitability, a land defined not by what it offers, but by what it denies. No agriculture, no settlement, no easy survival. Symbolically, it represents finality, the end. If the Templars believed that certain knowledge belonged at the end of the world, then marking that place symbolically would make sense, not to reveal it to outsiders, but to anchor it within their internal cosmology. Symbols do not always mark possession. Sometimes they mark intention. The equal-armed cross, often associated with the Templars, is not a symbol of conquest. It represents balance. For directions, the intersection of heaven and earth. In older traditions, it symbolizes the axis mundi, the center point around which the world turns. To place such a symbol at the far south would be paradoxical. Unless the intent was not geography but philosophy, the end of the world as a new center, place where cycles reset. This idea appears repeatedly in ancient mythologies. The world does not end in fire or flood permanently, it renews. Destruction clears the ground for rebirth. What survives is what was hidden, preserved, or carried away. Symbols placed in remote locations may not indicate settlement at all. They may indicate memory, a reminder that something was done there, something completed, something entrusted to silence. This perspective reframes the rumors of Templar symbols in distant lands. Instead of asking whether knights physically carved crosses in Antarctica, a question that invites ridicule, we should ask something more subtle. Did the Templars think symbolically about destinations? Did they encode meaning into geography itself? Maps already suggest this possibility. Certain medieval maps include symbolic markers in places that make no practical sense. Crosses placed in oceans, lines drawn toward blank spaces, notes written in coded Latin near the edges of the world. These are not navigational aids. They are messages. Messages meant to survive misinterpretation. If the Templars believed Antarctica or a similar southern extremity was significant, they would not have announced it. They would have marked it in a way that only initiates could understand. A symbol that looks like decoration to one observer, but like confirmation to another. This is how secret traditions endure. And symbols have another advantage. They outlive belief. A carving remains even when its meaning is forgotten. A geometric alignment persists even when the ritual that explained it is lost. Future generations may dismiss these things as coincidence, unaware that coincidence was the shield that protected them. This may explain why Antarctica today is curiously free of symbolic interpretation. It is treated purely as science. Data, ice cores, measurements. No mythology is allowed to attach itself. No history beyond the modern age is tolerated. It is as if the continent has been quarantined from meaning itself. This too is a kind of symbol. The absence of story is sometimes the strongest story of all. If the Templars chose Antarctica or any similarly unreachable place as a symbolic vault, then the lack of visible markers is not a failure. It is success, because the greatest symbol is one no longer recognized as such. And yet, hints remain. Not in stone, perhaps, but in continuity of obsession. Why does Antarctica repeatedly draw the attention of those searching for hidden knowledge? Why does it appear in myths, conspiracies, and secret expeditions long before it offers any practical value? Why does it feel guarded? Symbols do not compel belief. They invite attention. The Templars may have understood that future generations, armed with science rather than faith, would approach the world differently. They would drill, scan, measure. They would not pray or interpret allegory. But science too follows patterns. And when patterns repeat, questions arise. Perhaps the symbols were not meant for medieval minds at all. Perhaps they were meant for ours. For a time when humanity could peer beneath ice, decode geometry, and revisit old maps with new tools. A time when the language of symbols could be translated into data. If so, then the Templars were not hiding from the future. They were preparing for it. And Antarctica, silent, sealed, resistant, becomes not a random location, but the final page of a book meant to be read only when the reader had learned enough to understand why the previous chapters ended so abruptly. The symbols do not tell us what was hidden. They tell us that something was hidden deliberately, and that, sometimes, is the most important message of all. In the early 20th century, a new power became obsessed with the far south. It was not drawn there by science alone, nor by curiosity, and certainly not by resources, which at the time were poorly understood and economically irrelevant. What drew them was belief. Nazi Germany's fixation on Antarctica has often been dismissed as fringe myth, exaggerated by post-war speculation and conspiracy. But beneath the exaggeration lies a documented pattern of interest that is difficult to ignore. Expeditions were funded, maps were studied, symbols were invoked. And the language used to justify these efforts was not scientific, it was ideological. The Nazis believed history was broken, not morally but chronologically. They were convinced that humanity had forgotten its true origins, that ancient civilizations possessed knowledge and power lost through catastrophe, and that modern humanity was living in the ruins of something far greater. This belief did not come from nowhere. It was fueled by esoteric traditions that predated the Third Reich by centuries. Ideas drawn from German Romanticism, pseudo-archaeology, and distorted interpretations of ancient texts. The world, they believed, had been reset. Ice, flood, or fire had erased previous ages. What survived was scattered, hidden in myths, symbols, and inaccessible places. And Antarctica, to them, was not empty. It was sealed. In 1938, Nazi Germany launched the New Swabia expedition. Officially, it was a whaling and territorial reconnaissance mission. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. Aircraft flew over vast stretches of the continent, dropping thousands of metal markers emblazoned with swastikas. Photographs were taken. Ice-free areas were noted with particular interest. This was not how one behaves when merely mapping coastlines. It was how one behaves when claiming something symbolic. The obsession went deeper. Certain Nazi institutions, particularly the Antarctic, a research organization dedicated to uncovering ancient Germanic heritage, were tasked with finding evidence of lost civilizations, primordial knowledge, and ancestral power. They searched Tibet, Scandinavia, the Middle East, and the South. The idea that Antarctica might contain remnants of an earlier world fit perfectly into their worldview. A hidden land, preserved by ice, beyond history's reach, waiting to be reclaimed by those who understood its significance. What is rarely asked is where these ideas originated. The Nazis did not invent the concept of a forgotten southern world. They inherited it, filtered through centuries of speculation, misinterpretation, and selective reading of ancient sources. Medieval maps, classical texts, esoteric traditions. Some of those traditions intersect uncomfortably with those once guarded by the Templars. The Nazis were obsessed with symbols, runes, geometry, sacred sites aligned with stars. They believed power resided not just in weapons, but in locations, in places where the fabric of history itself was thin. This echoes older beliefs held by secretive orders long before them. What differentiates the Nazis from the Templars is intent. The Templars believed knowledge should be preserved. The Nazis believed it should be weaponized. This difference matters. If fragments of ancient geographic or cosmological knowledge survived into the modern era, embedded in maps, symbols, or half-understood legends, then they would inevitably attract those seeking dominance. Antarctica, as the ultimate unknown, became a projection screen for these ambitions. The Third Reich collapsed before any definitive discoveries could be made. Its Antarctic ambitions ended in defeat and secrecy. Records vanished. Archives burned. Survivors scattered. But the obsession did not die. It mutated. Post-war rumors spoke of hidden bases beneath the ice, of technology beyond understanding, of U-boats vanishing into the south. Most of these stories are almost certainly fiction, but fiction often grows around a kernel of unresolved truth. What matters is not whether the Nazis found anything. It is that they believed something could be found. And belief, when backed by state power, leaves traces. Why would a regime consumed by war divert resources to the most inhospitable place on Earth? Why invest in exploration that offered no immediate military return? Because Antarctica was never about strategy. It was about origin. The Nazis believed that whoever controlled humanity's forgotten past could shape its future. They sought legitimacy not from morality, but from antiquity. To be heirs to a primordial civilization was to justify supremacy. This is where the connection to older orders becomes unsettling. If the Templars hid knowledge to prevent misuse, then the Nazis represent exactly the kind of force they would have feared. A power hungry for myth, willing to twist fragments of truth into justification for violence. From this perspective, Antarctica becomes more than a destination. It becomes a battleground of intent. Not physical combat, but ideological. Who controls the narrative of humanity's past? Who decides which histories are remembered and which are erased? The Nazis failed in their ambitions, but their interest left a mark. It planted Antarctica firmly within the imagination of secret knowledge and forbidden history, a place where answers might lie buried beneath ice. And once planted, that idea could not be uprooted. It resurfaced repeatedly, in intelligence circles, in fringe research, in whispers about post-war expeditions that went further than acknowledged, in questions about why certain regions remain restricted and why information is filtered so carefully. Again, most of this can be explained by geopolitics and science. But explanation does not erase resonance. The same place that drew medieval speculation, Templar secrecy, and esoteric mapping traditions later drew one of the most obsessive regimes in history. That pattern alone deserves attention, because Antarctica does not offer conquest. It offers obscurity, and obscurity attracts those who believe something has been deliberately hidden. The Nazis were not subtle. They chased power openly and violently. If they believed Antarctica held something transformative, it was because they had encountered ideas suggesting it might. Ideas that did not originate with them. Ideas that had survived collapse, censorship, and ridicule. Ideas that someone, at some point, thought important enough to hide at the end of the world. In the end, the Nazi obsession tells us less about what they found, and more about what they were looking for. They were searching for a past that justified domination. The Templars, by contrast, may have hidden a past to prevent it. And Antarctica, silent and sealed, remains the same in both stories. Not as proof, not as revelation, but as a reminder that some places attract belief because belief once passed through them. Whether as guardians or as thieves, those who seek the frozen continent seem drawn by the same question. What if history did not begin where we think it did? And what if the answer lies somewhere no empire, no ideology, and no ambition can easily reach? In 1946, barely a year after the end of the Second World War, the United States launched the largest military expedition to Antarctica in history. It was called Operation High Jump. Officially, it was a training exercise, a chance to test men, ships, and equipment in extreme cold. A scientific mission to expand knowledge of polar conditions. On paper, it sounded reasonable, even mundane. In reality, it made no sense. More than 4,700 personnel were deployed. 13 ships, aircraft carriers, submarines, icebreakers, advanced reconnaissance planes. This was not a small-scale scientific venture. It was a full military operation, mounted at enormous cost, at a time when the world was exhausted by war and desperate to rebuild. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. Months ahead of schedule. With little explanation, Admiral Richard E. Byrd, one of the most experienced polar explorers in history, was placed in command. He was not a man easily frightened by ice or isolation. He had flown over both poles. He understood Antarctica better than almost anyone alive. And yet, after High Jump, his public statements were strange. In an interview given shortly after the expedition, Byrd warned that the United States must prepare for the possibility of being attacked by aircraft capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speed. The comment was brushed off as Cold War anxiety, a general warning about future warfare. But context matters. No such aircraft existed at the time. No nation possessed polar-capable air fleets that could strike from Antarctica. The remark felt less like speculation and more like reference. Reference to something already imagined or already seen. Official records state that Operation High Jump was successful. Equipment was tested. Data was gathered. Crews returned safely. And yet, casualty reports were quietly acknowledged. Aircraft were lost. Men died. Details were scarce. Why rush such a massive operation into the most hostile environment on Earth, only to abandon it prematurely? The official explanation never fully satisfied. This silence created space, and space invites questions. Some suggest the operation was meant to secure territory before other powers could. Others argue it was reconnaissance, pure and simple, a show of force, a rehearsal for Cold War logistics. All of these explanations are plausible. None of them explain the urgency. The war had just ended. The United States held unmatched military power. There was no immediate threat in Antarctica. No enemy bases. No strategic resource race yet underway. Unless the concern was not about the future. Unless it was about the past. Operation High Jump occurred at a moment when intelligence agencies were absorbing enormous amounts of captured material. Nazi archives, scientific projects, esoteric research, maps, speculation, half-finished ideas torn from the hands of a defeated regime. Among these materials were references, vague, fragmented, often dismissed, to Antarctic interest, to earlier expeditions, to rumors of what lay beneath the ice. Most of it was nonsense. But intelligence work does not discard everything labeled nonsense. Catalogs it. If even a fraction of that material suggested something anomalous, something worth verifying, then a rapid, overwhelming expedition makes sense. Not to discover publicly, but to check quietly, to confirm or deny. And if confirmation leaned even slightly toward the unexpected, then withdrawal would be the safest response. Because confirmation creates responsibility. There is another detail that often escapes notice. Operation High Jump was not purely American in consequence. Its outcome influenced international policy almost immediately. Within a decade, Antarctica would be effectively locked down through treaties. Military activity was restricted. Territorial claims were frozen. Access was controlled. Again, all of this can be explained rationally. Antarctica was declared a scientific preserve, a neutral zone, a place for cooperation rather than conflict. But neutrality is also a way to control curiosity. When something is declared off-limits, people stop asking why. The timing is revealing. Never before had humanity possessed the technology to penetrate ice, map subglacial terrain, and project power across the globe so quickly. Never before had the possibility existed to truly explore Antarctica's interior. And just as that possibility emerged, Antarctica was sealed by agreement. This does not mean something was found, but it does suggest something was feared. Admiral Byrd himself remains an enigmatic figure. In private writings and later retellings, stories emerged of flights over regions that did not match expectations, of open areas, of strange formations. Most of these accounts are contested, exaggerated, or secondhand. But the emotional tone remains consistent. Surprise, not terror, not triumph. Surprise, the kind that unsettles assumptions. It is worth remembering that High Jump was not the last Antarctic operation. It was followed by Operation Windmill and others, though none matched its scale. The intensity faded, but the interest did not vanish. Instead, it became quieter, scientific, bureaucratic. This mirrors a familiar pattern. When something challenges accepted frameworks, the response is rarely open confrontation. It is containment, redefinition, absorption into structures that drain it of disruptive potential. Antarctica became a place of data, not story. Ice cores, not legends. Temperature graphs, not maps. And yet, certain questions linger. Why deploy aircraft carriers to an uninhabited continent? Why train for combat in a place with no enemy? Why end the operation early if it was going according to plan? Operation High Jump sits at a crossroads of history, between myth and modernity, between wartime secrecy and peacetime narrative control. It does not prove anything, but it aligns disturbingly well with a longer pattern. Medieval secrecy, esoteric obsession, Nazi fixation, sudden post-war urgency, and then silence. Each era approaches Antarctica differently, but always with a sense that it matters more than it should. The Templars, if they hid something, would have chosen a place that forces future civilizations to confront their own limits before reaching it. A place that demands technology, cooperation, and humility. By the mid-20th century, humanity finally possessed the tools to try. Operation High Jump may have been the first moment when the modern world stood at the threshold of something ancient, whether knowledge, memory, or simply realization. And thresholds are dangerous, because once crossed, they cannot be uncrossed. If nothing unusual was found, then High Jump was an overreaction. A footnote, a curiosity. But if something unexpected was glimpsed, even briefly, then ending the operation early may have been the most responsible decision possible. Better to leave questions unanswered than to awaken something the world was not prepared to understand. Antarctica returned to silence. The ice closed ranks. And history once again moved on, carrying with it the uneasy sense that not all investigations are meant to reach their conclusion. Some are meant to stop at the edge, and leave the rest frozen in place. After Operation High Jump faded from public attention, something subtle but profound took place. Antarctica went quiet, not silent in the literal sense, Research continued, flags were planted, ice cores were drilled, but narratively quiet. The tone shifted. Where there had once been urgency, speculation, and military presence, there was now restraint. Where curiosity might have grown unchecked, it was gently redirected. In 1959, the Antarctic Treaty was signed. On the surface, it was a triumph of diplomacy. Nations agreed that Antarctica would be used only for peaceful purposes. Military activity was banned. Nuclear testing was prohibited. Scientific cooperation was encouraged. Territorial claims were effectively frozen in time. Sounded ideal. And in many ways it was. But treaties do not exist in a vacuum. They arise in response to pressure, to perceived risk. And the Antarctic Treaty was unlike any other agreement in history. No other continent had ever been removed so completely from ordinary human ambition. No private ownership. No permanent population. No unrestricted access. Antarctica became a place humanity could visit, but never possess. The official explanation was protection of science, of peace, of a fragile environment. Yet protection always has a second function. Controls who asks questions. Access to Antarctica is not impossible, but it is tightly regulated. Expeditions require permits. Routes are monitored. Activities are defined in advance. Deviations are discouraged. Areas of special interest are designated off-limits. This is not how we treat deserts, jungles, or oceans. This is how we treat vaults. The silence that followed high jump was not the absence of activity. It was the absence of narrative. Antarctica was reframed as empty, inhospitable, and uninteresting beyond climate data. A continent without story. And that framing has been remarkably successful. Ask most people what Antarctica is, and they will say ice, penguins, science. Few will mention history. Fewer still will consider the possibility of anything beneath the ice worth remembering. This did not happen by accident. Human curiosity thrives on stories. Remove the story, and curiosity withers. Antarctica became a place of numbers and measurements, not meaning. Even anomalies were absorbed into technical language that stripped them of wonder. Strange radar readings became subglacial features. Unusual formations became natural processes. Unexplained gaps became data limitations. All true, all sufficient, and all conveniently final. This pattern mirrors older methods of containment. When the Templars were destroyed, their story was reframed as heresy and greed. When Nazi esotericism collapsed, its obsessions were dismissed as madness. In both cases, dangerous questions were neutralized not by answering them, but by discrediting the context in which they arose. Antarctica received similar treatment. Anything beyond accepted scientific discourse was labeled conspiracy. Speculation became ridicule. The idea that history might extend beneath the ice was treated as fantasy, regardless of how many unanswered questions remained. This creates a powerful barrier. Not physical, psychological, because few researchers want to risk credibility by asking questions that fall outside the approved narrative. The silence deepens. It is also worth noting how little of Antarctica has actually been seen. Despite decades of research, the vast majority of the continent remains unexplored in any meaningful sense. Ice sheets kilometers thick obscure the land beneath. Drilling is expensive and slow. Radar provides outlines, not stories. We know shapes. We do not know context. And context is where history lives. When subglacial lakes were discovered, vast bodies of water sealed beneath ice for millions of years, the reaction was cautious excitement. Strict protocols were introduced to prevent contamination. Exploration was delayed. Samples were limited. Again, reasonable, but also revealing. Antarctica is treated less like a frontier and more like a sealed archive. This treatment raises a quiet question. What if the silence is not just about protection of the environment? What if it is about protection from implication? Because if something were found beneath the ice that challenged established timelines, not ruins necessarily, but evidence of prior habitability or anomalous human interaction, the consequences would ripple far beyond geology. History would need revision. Foundations would shift. and institutions built on certainty would be forced to adapt. The Templars understood this kind of risk intimately. They lived in a world where knowledge could destabilize kingdoms, where ideas could burn cities, where truths, once spoken, could not be recalled. Their solution was silence through removal. Modern society's solution is silence through structure. Permits, treaties, peer review, funding priorities. None of these are malicious, but together they shape what can be asked, and what cannot. The silence after High Jump was not dramatic. There were no cover stories, no public bans on discussion. Instead, Antarctica was absorbed into routine, made dull, made safe, which is perhaps the most effective form of concealment, because people rarely question what bores them. And yet, Antarctica refuses to fully cooperate. Anomalies continue to surface. Subglacial mountains rivaling the Alps. Lake systems interconnected beneath kilometers of ice. Heat sources beneath regions that should be frozen solid. Magnetic irregularities that complicate navigation. Each discovery adds detail. None provide explanation. The continent feels unfinished, as if something is being revealed slowly, reluctantly, on a timeline not entirely controlled by us. This sensation that Antarctica is withholding something has persisted across centuries. From medieval speculation to modern science, it occupies the same symbolic role. The place where answers go to wait. If the Templars hid knowledge there, they chose well. Because even now, with satellites and supercomputers, the continent resists interpretation. It reveals facts, but not meaning. Meaning requires narrative. And Antarctica has been carefully denied one. Perhaps this is intentional. Perhaps silence is not a failure of curiosity, but a recognition of responsibility. The understanding that some discoveries, once made public, cannot be undone. Or perhaps silence is simply habit. The inheritance of decisions made long ago by people who chose containment over confrontation. We may never know whether the silence after High Jump was motivated by discovery, caution, or coincidence. But we do know this. Antarctica is not treated like other places. Its past is considered irrelevant. Its future is tightly managed. And its present exists in a strange state of suspended attention. The Templars believed in preservation across ages. They believed some truths should sleep until the world was ready to receive them. Whether Antarctica contains such a truth is still unknown. But the silence surrounding it, layered, institutional, and enduring, feels less like ignorance, and more like patience. To understand why the Templars might have chosen silence over survival, we have to step inside a mindset that no longer exists in the modern world. The Knights Templar did not think like empire builders. They did not think like merchants. And despite appearances, they did not even think like ordinary soldiers. Their true loyalty was not to territory, wealth, or recognition. It was to continuity. In medieval philosophy, preservation was not passive. It was an active moral duty. Knowledge was seen as something entrusted, not owned. To misuse it was a sin equal to destroying it. To reveal it to those unprepared was considered dangerous, even cruel. This belief did not originate with Christianity alone. It echoes older traditions, Jewish mysticism, Neoplatonism, early Gnostic thought, all of which treat knowledge as layered. Some truths are safe for everyone. Others are not. The Templars absorbed this worldview early. They were initiates long before they were knights. Initiation is not about learning secrets. It is about learning restraint, about understanding when not to speak, about accepting that silence can be more faithful than testimony. This is why their order emphasized obedience so heavily. Not blind obedience to authority, but obedience to structure, to timing, to purpose. Individual ambition was suppressed because individual ambition leads to disclosure. A single careless voice can undo generations of protection. This philosophy explains many of their contradictions. Why they accumulated wealth but lived austerely. Why they mastered warfare but avoided conquest. Why they gathered knowledge but did not publish it. They were not preparing to rule the world. They were preparing to outlast it. In this light, the fall of the order looks very different. The arrests, the torture, the executions, all catastrophic on a human level, did not necessarily represent failure on a philosophical one. If preservation was the goal, then sacrifice was acceptable. This is a difficult idea for modern minds. We equate survival with success. We assume any organization destroyed by force has failed. But the Templars operated on a longer timeline. They believed civilizations were temporary. Empires rise, codify truth, and then collapse under their own rigidity. What survives those collapses is what was never fully integrated into power structures. This is why they distrusted visibility. Visibility attracts control, and control inevitably distorts. By the late 13th century, the Templars had become too visible. Their power was obvious, their independence intolerable, their knowledge suspect. From their perspective, destruction may have been inevitable. So the question becomes not, how did they fail? But, how did they respond to inevitability? Preservation requires planning for loss, not just of assets but of identity. The Templars understood that to protect something across centuries, it must be detached from any single name, symbol, or institution. Names can be outlawed, symbols can be banned, institutions can be burned. But ideas, once decentralized, are far harder to erase. This is why they embedded meaning in geometry rather than doctrine, in routes rather than texts, in practices rather than proclamations. And when the moment came, they allowed the order to die publicly. A visible death creates closure. Closure allows the world to move on. Meanwhile, whatever truly mattered was already elsewhere. This philosophy also explains why they did not resist militarily. A violent uprising would have drawn attention to exactly what they wished to protect. It would have invited investigation, looting, interrogation on a scale that even silence could not withstand. Instead, they accepted martyrdom, not as victims but as custodians completing their final duty. This reframes the image of Jacques de Molay at the stake. His words were not a defense. They were a boundary. He spoke just enough to preserve dignity, but not enough to endanger anything else. Silence was the last safeguard. Antarctica, in this context, becomes a philosophical solution rather than a geographical curiosity. It is not chosen because it is mysterious. It is chosen because it is hostile to misuse. A place no empire can exploit, no ideology can occupy, no population can dominate. It resists human ambition by its very nature. To place something there is to remove it from cycles of power entirely. This aligns perfectly with the Templar worldview. If knowledge survives catastrophe, it must do so in a form that discourages exploitation. Ice is an ethical barrier. It forces effort, cooperation, and humility. It filters seekers from conquerors. Only those willing to invest without guarantee reach it. This is not unlike initiation. The journey itself is the test. If the Templars believed humanity was not yet ready to confront certain truths about past civilizations, about cyclical collapse, about the fragility of progress, then delaying that confrontation was not deception. It was mercy, because premature revelation can do harm. We see this repeatedly in history. Technologies introduced without ethical frameworks lead to destruction. Ideas introduced without social readiness provoke violence. Truth, untempered by wisdom, destabilizes. The Templars may have concluded that the world of their time, racked by war, plague, and rigid authority, was not capable of integrating certain understandings. So they chose absence. Absence is powerful. It creates gaps in history that provoke curiosity centuries later, when conditions are different. When inquiry replaces dogma. When science replaces fear. In that sense, preservation is not about freezing the past. It is about timing the future. The modern world may finally be approaching the threshold the Templars anticipated. We possess the technology to explore Antarctica meaningfully. We question linear history. We recognize that civilizations can collapse suddenly. We are beginning to understand that progress is not guaranteed. And yet, we still struggle with restraint. We still rush to exploit before we understand. We still publish before we reflect. We still seek dominance where stewardship would suffice. This tension mirrors the ancient one. Perhaps that is why Antarctica remains resistant. Not just physically but institutionally. Why access is controlled. Why exploration proceeds cautiously. Why narrative remains sparse. It is as if humanity, collectively, has inherited the same instinct the Templars acted upon individually. Slow down. Not everything needs to be known immediately. Not every discovery must be announced. Some truths require maturity. If the Templars hid knowledge at the end of the world, they did so trusting that humanity would eventually become capable of finding it. Not by accident, but by readiness. Readiness measured not by technology, but by humility. Whether or not Antarctica holds a literal archive, the philosophy behind its selection is clear. Preservation is not about hiding forever. It is about waiting long enough. And perhaps the greatest legacy of the Knights Templar is not a secret buried beneath ice, but the example they left behind. That sometimes, the most faithful act is not to reveal the truth, but to protect the world from it until it learns how to listen. Imagine a place designed not by human hands, but by indifference. A land so hostile that ambition freezes before it can take root. A continent without cities, without borders, without memory. Except the kind buried deep beneath layers of ice that renew themselves endlessly. Antarctica is not just remote. It is resistant. And resistance is what makes it the perfect vault. A human-built vault invites attack. Locks can be broken. Walls can be breached. Guards can be bribed. Every fortress eventually falls. But a natural vault does not negotiate. Ice does not respond to power. Cold does not respect authority. Distance does not care about belief. To reach Antarctica, one must surrender comfort, certainty, and speed. The journey strips away entitlement. If the Templars sought a place where something could be hidden without being guarded, Antarctica offers exactly that. Not because it conceals well, but because it discourages access altogether. This reframes the question of why Antarctica, if it was chosen, would make sense not as a destination of secrecy, but as a destination of surrender. A place where knowledge is entrusted to forces beyond human control. Ice preserves. Unlike soil or water, ice slows decay. It arrests time. Organic material, structures, even atmospheres can survive for tens of thousands of years when sealed properly. Modern science relies on this principle constantly, drilling ice cores to recover climate history. The Templars would not have understood ice chemistry, but they understood preservation. They lived in an age where monasteries safeguarded texts precisely because isolation protected them. Cold stone walls, remoteness, repetition. Antarctica is the monastery of the earth itself. But unlike a monastery, it cannot be overrun. Even if someone knew exactly where something was hidden, retrieval would not be trivial. It would require cooperation, planning, and resources far beyond any medieval or early modern state. Which makes the act of hiding something there an act of faith, not in secrecy but in time. Time will decide who is worthy. This idea resonates deeply with Templar philosophy. They were obsessed with the long view, with legacy measured in centuries, with actions whose results would not be seen by those who initiated them. A vault beneath ice is not for immediate use. It is for inheritance. And inheritance requires trust in the future. What might such a vault contain? Not treasure in the conventional sense. Gold corrodes meaning. It invites plunder. It fuels greed. The Templars understood this too well. The vault, if it exists, would contain context. Records, maps, explanations. Knowledge not meant to empower rulers, but to orient survivors. Survivors of what? Catastrophe. The medieval world was obsessed with apocalypse. Plagues swept continents. Famines erased populations. Wars collapsed dynasties. The idea that civilization could end suddenly was not theoretical. And older texts spoke of greater catastrophes still. Floods that reshaped the world. Fires that reset the sky. Ice that swallowed lands. If the Templars encountered evidence that humanity had been nearly erased before, then preparing for recurrence would be rational. A vault becomes a lifeline across collapse. Not a bunker to hide people, but a memory to restore meaning afterward. Antarctica's remoteness ensures that whatever is placed there is unlikely to be affected by human conflict. No army marches across Antarctica. No empire taxes it. No ideology colonizes it easily. It remains neutral by force of nature. This neutrality is critical. If knowledge is to survive collapse, it must not be tied to any one culture. Otherwise, when that culture falls, the knowledge dies with it. A vault at the end of the world belongs to no one. It waits. The idea that ancient civilizations might have done something similar is not unprecedented. Sacred caches, time capsules, ark myths, all point to a human instinct to preserve something essential against disaster. What makes Antarctica unique is scale. A vault hidden beneath kilometers of ice does not need to be disguised. It does not need guards or secrecy beyond initial placement. The environment does the work. This suggests that whoever placed something there expected long delays. Delays measured not in decades, but in epochs. The Templars, though medieval, thought in these terms. They believed God operated across ages, that divine plans were not limited to human lifespans, that patience was a form of faith. From this perspective, Antarctica is not an escape route. It is a pause button. History continues elsewhere. Empires rise and fall. Beliefs shift. Technologies advance. And somewhere, something remains untouched, waiting for the moment when conditions align. Modern humanity may be approaching that moment without realizing it. Climate change is reshaping polar regions. Ice is thinning. Subglacial landscapes are becoming more accessible. Technologies capable of penetrating ice without contamination are advancing. For the first time in history, Antarctica is becoming legible. Not hospitable, but readable. If something was hidden there, its concealment was never meant to be permanent. Only long enough, which raises an uncomfortable question. How will we behave if we find it? The Templars believed knowledge carried moral weight. That discovery without wisdom leads to destruction. They chose preservation over revelation. Modern civilization often chooses the opposite. We publish before we reflect. We monetize before we understand. We extract before we ask whether we should. A vault beneath the ice, if it exists, tests not our technology but our maturity. It asks whether we can encounter something extraordinary without immediately exploiting it. Whether we can integrate knowledge without weaponizing it. Whether we can learn from the past without repeating it. Perhaps that is the true function of Antarctica as a vault. Not to hide something from us forever, but to force us to become the kind of species capable of handling what was hidden. The Templars may have trusted that humanity would evolve. Not biologically, ethically. Whether that trust was justified remains an open question. Because a vault at the end of the world is not just a container. It is a mirror. It reflects back the intentions of whoever opens it. And if Antarctica is ever unlocked, the most important thing revealed may not be what was hidden beneath the ice, but who we have become by the time we are able to reach it. If the Templars truly sought a place where something could be hidden beyond the reach of power, time, and greed, Antarctica offers a logic that is almost unsettling in its perfection. It is not merely remote. It is inhospitable by design. A continent that resists habitation, resists conquest, resists even curiosity unless that curiosity is backed by immense effort. No roads lead there. No empires border it. No population can grow around it to demand access or ownership. Antarctica exists outside the rhythms that shape human history, and that is exactly what makes it useful. A vault is only as strong as its ability to discourage intrusion. Most vaults rely on secrecy or force. Antarctica relies on neither. It relies on indifference. The medieval mind did not fear the end of the world in the way we imagine today. For them, an ending was never final. It was a turning. Time was not a straight line stretching endlessly forward. It was a wheel. Ages rose, decayed, and gave way to something else. Scripture hinted at this. So did older traditions preserved in fragments, half-remembered myths, and forbidden texts that circulated quietly beyond official doctrine. The Templars lived within this worldview. They saw history as layered, one civilization built atop the ruins of another. They believed faith itself had survived collapse before, carried forward by those willing to preserve it in secret. Catastrophe was not proof of failure. It was part of the design. This perspective changes how we understand fear. Fear was not of destruction itself. Fear was of forgetting. To forget was to repeat mistakes blindly. To lose knowledge was to stumble into the same disasters again, unprepared. Preservation was therefore an act of hope, not despair. This belief appears repeatedly in medieval theology. The Book of Revelation was not merely prophecy, it was warning. A reminder that civilizations built on pride collapse under their own weight. That faith without humility invites correction. The Templars may have taken this warning literally. They lived through crusades that failed, through alliances that dissolved, through institutions that claimed permanence and then shattered. They saw how easily truth could be twisted to justify power. If knowledge existed that revealed how often humanity had already fallen and risen again, then releasing it into a world intoxicated by certainty would have been dangerous. Better to wait. This is where Antarctica becomes more than geography. It becomes eschatology. In medieval symbolism, the ends of the world were not simply distant places. They were thresholds between ages, points where old cycles closed and new ones began. The North and South Poles, though poorly understood physically, held symbolic weight as anchors of the Earth itself. To place something at the end of the world was to place it outside time. A message meant not for the present age but for the next. This idea echoes the biblical concept of sealing. In Revelation, certain knowledge is sealed until the appointed time. Not destroyed, not lost, simply withheld until humanity reaches a moment of readiness. The Templars may have seen themselves as participants in this process. Not prophets, not rulers, custodians. The fear that motivated them was not fear of punishment. It was fear of misuse. Knowledge of cyclical destruction changes how societies see themselves. It undermines myths of inevitability and chosen status. It humbles empires, but it can also be twisted. A ruler might use such knowledge to justify oppression, claiming collapse is unavoidable, suffering necessary, domination divinely ordained. An ideology might weaponize it to argue that only certain people deserve to survive the next cycle. The Nazis would later do exactly this. The Templars, centuries earlier, may have sensed this danger intuitively. They understood that truth without ethical grounding becomes a tool of cruelty. So they chose delay. Delay is not denial. It is discipline. Antarctica, frozen and remote, becomes the perfect embodiment of this philosophy. A place that forces patience, that resists haste, that waits through centuries without change. Ice ages themselves are symbols of reset. They reshape landscapes, erase coastlines, scatter populations, and then they retreat, revealing a world altered but renewed. To hide knowledge beneath ice is to align it with the rhythm of the planet itself. The idea of cycles also reframes the emotional weight of the Templars' end. Their destruction was not an ultimate defeat. It was a phase transition. One form ended so another could continue invisibly. Faith, in this sense, was not belief in victory. It was belief in return, that what is preserved will reemerge when conditions allow. Modern humanity stands at an uncomfortable crossroads. Climate instability, technological acceleration, political fragmentation. For the first time, we recognize our own vulnerability on a global scale. We are beginning to understand that collapse is not ancient history. It is a recurring possibility. This realization brings us closer to the mindset the Templars inhabited. We, too, are asking what should be preserved if things go wrong. What knowledge matters? What stories must survive? Digital archives, seed vaults, cultural repositories. These are modern equivalents of the same instinct. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault is often called the Doomsday Vault, a place designed to preserve life through catastrophe. Antarctica functions similarly on a planetary scale. The Templars may have intuited this long before science gave it language. They believed the end of an age was not something to fear blindly. It was something to prepare for thoughtfully. And preparation did not mean weapons or fortresses. It meant memory. Memory carried forward so the next beginning would not be blind. This casts their silence in a new light. They were not hiding from the world. They were preparing for a future version of it. A version that might understand what they could not safely explain. And so the question is no longer whether the Templars believed in apocalypse. They almost certainly did. The question is what kind of apocalypse they anticipated. Not divine punishment, not final judgment, but reset, a return to zero. If that reset comes, whether through climate, war, or something we have not yet imagined, then knowledge preserved beyond reach becomes invaluable. Antarctica, silent and patient, stands as a reminder that the planet itself has endured many endings, and will endure many more. If something was placed there with intention, it was not meant to save one civilization. It was meant to save the possibility of civilization itself. And that is a far heavier responsibility than conquest, power, or fame. The Templars accepted that responsibility and paid for it with erasure. But erasure in a cyclical worldview is not the end. It is simply the quiet space between one age and the next. For centuries, people have searched for the Templars' treasure. They imagine chests of gold hidden in forests, jewels sealed beneath ruined chapels, relics buried in caves. These stories persist because they are simple. They fit a familiar narrative. Powerful men, sudden destruction, secret wealth left behind. But this idea misunderstands the Templars completely. Gold was never their greatest asset. Gold moves hands. Gold corrupts. Gold leaves trails of blood and envy. An order as disciplined and long-sighted as the Templars would have known that hoarding wealth guarantees attention and eventual theft. If they hid anything at all, it was not treasure. It was truth. Truth that could not be monetized, but could destabilize everything built on ignorance. What kind of truth is more dangerous than gold? A truth about humanity itself. The Templars lived at a unique historical junction. They saw the collision of civilizations firsthand. They watched empires claim divine authority and then collapse. They witnessed faith used as both refuge and weapon. And through their access to ancient texts and cross-cultural knowledge, they may have glimpsed a larger pattern. That humanity is not on a simple upward path. That progress is fragile. That civilizations forget more than they remember. If they encountered evidence of advanced societies predating recorded history, whether through maps, myths, or preserved records, that knowledge would have shattered medieval certainty. It would have challenged the idea that their world was special, chosen, final. And that is precisely why it would have been dangerous. Because truth does not exist in a vacuum. It interacts with power. Imagine revealing to kings and popes that other civilizations once rose higher and still fell. That divine favor did not prevent collapse. That history was cyclical, not linear. Such knowledge would undermine authority overnight. It would invite despair in some, and ruthless ambition in others. The Templars may have realized this early. They did not treat knowledge as something to be proclaimed. They treated it as something to be guarded. Not because it was false, but because it was incomplete without wisdom. Truth without context becomes poison. This reframes the accusations against them. They were not condemned for immorality so much as for deviation, for knowing something outside the sanctioned story, for hinting that the Church's narrative was not the only possible one. If they possessed maps showing lands unknown, or records suggesting past ages erased by catastrophe, those would not have been mere curiosities. They would have been existential threats, because they would raise an unbearable question. What if this world is not permanent? What if we are not the first? And what if we will not be the last? The Templar silence begins to look less like secrecy and more like responsibility. They understood that truth delivered at the wrong time can destroy more than it enlightens. So instead of releasing it, they chose preservation. Preservation does not mean hiding forever. It means delaying until understanding can grow around it. Antarctica, in this sense, becomes symbolic as much as practical. It is not a place of wealth, but of waiting. A place where truth can remain untouched by human ambition until humanity evolves enough to face it. If something was hidden there, it was likely not a single object. It was a collection of understanding, maps, records, interpretations, pieces of a puzzle explaining humanity's forgotten past. Not answers. Context. Context is more powerful than answers because it reframes everything that comes after. Consider how modern discoveries already unsettle us. Göbekli Tepe forces us to reconsider the origins of religion. Genetic studies reveal migrations older than civilization. Climate records show how quickly stable worlds can vanish. Each discovery is manageable on its own. Together, they hint at something larger. The Templars may have glimpsed that larger picture long ago, in fragments that felt too dangerous to assemble publicly. They may have seen enough to know that humanity's story was not what it believed. And that belief, once broken, changes behavior. Some would respond with humility, others with panic, others with domination. The Nazis, centuries later, offer a chilling example of what happens when fragments of ancient truth are twisted by ideology. They did not seek wisdom. They sought justification. The Templars likely feared exactly this. So they chose absence. They let themselves be erased so that what they knew could survive unclaimed. If truth was hidden, it was hidden not to keep people ignorant forever, but to protect the future from the worst impulses of the present. This gives their sacrifice a different weight. They did not die to protect gold. They died to protect restraint. The idea that not all truths should be used immediately. That some truths must wait for a different kind of humanity. The emotional core of this story is not mystery. It is tragedy. Men who understood too much too early, living in a world not prepared to listen. An order that accepted destruction rather than compromise its duty to preserve. We like to imagine that we would do better. That if given access to such knowledge today, we would respond wisely. But are we certain? Our world is faster, louder, more reactive. Information spreads instantly, stripped of nuance. Truth is monetized, politicized, weaponized. Would ancient knowledge be studied carefully or exploited? Would it inspire humility or competition? These are the questions the Templars may have asked themselves. And when they looked at their world, they chose to wait. If Antarctica holds anything, it is not a reward. It is a responsibility, a test not of curiosity, but of character. Because the most powerful truth the Templars may have hidden is not about maps, continents, or lost civilizations. It is this: humanity has been here before. Humanity has fallen before. And whether it rises again depends not on what it knows, but on how it chooses to know it. If that truth was hidden at the end of the world, then it was hidden not out of fear, but out of hope. For the Knights Templar, that price was not paid in gold or territory, but in suffering, erasure, and death. Their story is often told as one of greed punished by power, but that framing is too small. What truly destroyed them was not what they owned, it was what they knew, and the danger others believed that knowledge represented. To know too much in a rigid world is to become a threat. The Templars existed in a society that depended on certainty. God had a plan. Kings ruled by divine right. History flowed in a straight, ordered line toward judgment. To suggest otherwise was not merely controversial, it was destabilizing. If the Templars encountered evidence of lost ages, forgotten civilizations, or cyclical catastrophe, then their understanding of faith would have shifted profoundly. Faith would no longer be about finality. It would be about endurance. And endurance does not require obedience to power. This is where fear enters the story. Institutions do not fear ignorance. They fear alternative frameworks. A man who believes the world has ended before will not be easily intimidated by threats of destruction. A knight who understands that empires collapse will not bow readily to kings. A priest who sees history as cyclical will not accept claims of absolute authority. Such people are dangerous, not because they seek rebellion, but because they are immune to certain forms of control. The accusations against the Templars make sense in this light. Heresy, secret rites, forbidden knowledge. These were not crimes of behavior. They were crimes of perspective. Torture was used not to uncover facts, but to break silence. To force confession not because truth was needed, but because submission was demanded. And yet, even under unimaginable pain, the core remained protected. Men confessed to acts they did not commit. They repeated lies suggested to them, but they did not reveal what truly mattered. That silence cost them everything. The price of knowing too much was annihilation, but the price of revealing too much would have been worse. This dilemma, whether to speak and endanger the future, or remain silent and accept destruction, defines the tragedy of the Templars. It is easy to romanticize them as martyrs or villains. It is harder to sit with the moral weight of their choice. They chose to vanish rather than betray stewardship. Even knowing its location would not make retrieval easy. The effort required would filter out opportunists and leave only those truly committed. That filter is important. The Templars were deeply suspicious of sudden access to powerful knowledge. They believed that wisdom must be earned through struggle and patience. Antarctica enforces exactly that kind of initiation. You do not stumble upon it. You prepare. You endure. You risk failure. This is not accidental. It is philosophical. The question of what such a vault might contain often drifts toward dramatic imagery, golden relics, forbidden devices, lost technologies. But these ideas miss the point. Gold invites theft. Technology invites misuse. What endures across collapse is understanding, context, explanation. A vault at the end of the world would not exist to empower rulers. It would exist to orient survivors, those who come after disaster, searching not for advantage, but for meaning. The medieval world was no stranger to catastrophe. Plagues erased entire generations. Wars shattered social order. Climate shifts caused famine and migration. To a Templar, the idea that civilization could vanish was not theoretical. Older texts spoke of greater disasters still. Floods that reshaped continents. Fires that erased cities. Ice that swallowed land and memory alike. If the Templars encountered convincing evidence of such cycles, whether through ancient maps, legends, or buried records, then planning for recurrence would have been rational. A vault becomes an act of compassion, not for the present but for the future. Antarctica, uniquely, is likely to survive whatever humanity does to itself. Nuclear war, climate collapse, ideological annihilation, all leave the polar ice relatively untouched in the short term. While coastlines drown and cities burn, Antarctica remains distant, quiet, sealed. That makes it an archive not of human culture, but of human potential. A place to store the idea of who we were and who we might become again. The Templars believed that knowledge untethered from ethics is destructive. They saw how power corrupts, how institutions twist truth to justify dominance. By placing knowledge beyond reach, they removed it from these dynamics entirely. No king could seize it. No pope could censor it. No empire could weaponize it. In doing so, they accepted that history would misunderstand them, that their name would be tarnished, that their motives would be questioned for centuries. This is not the behavior of men chasing power. It is the behavior of men choosing containment. The emotional cost of this choice cannot be overstated. These were not abstract guardians. They were individuals with lives, loyalties, and faith. They watched brothers burned alive. They endured humiliation and pain knowing that vindication would never come in their lifetime. And still, they held the line. Modern society struggles to comprehend this kind of sacrifice. We live in an age where visibility is survival, where silence is assumed to imply guilt, where truth is demanded instantly and relentlessly. But the medieval world understood something we have forgotten. That silence can be an ethical act. That restraint can be a form of courage. The Templars' story echoes through history because it sits at an uncomfortable intersection. It forces us to ask whether there are circumstances under which withholding truth is justified, whether protection of the future can outweigh the rights of the present. These are not easy questions, and they do not have comforting answers. What makes the Templars' fate especially poignant is that they did not live to see whether their sacrifice mattered. They could not know if what they preserved would survive. They trusted in process, not outcome. That trust is rare. It requires belief not in reward, but in responsibility. This is where Antarctica re-enters the emotional frame of the story. If something was hidden there, knowledge, context, memory, then it exists because someone accepted unimaginable loss to protect it. Not heroes in shining armor, but quiet men who believed the world was not yet ready. Their suffering becomes part of the preservation itself. A warning encoded in blood rather than ink. To access what was hidden, humanity must confront that warning. Because knowledge gained without acknowledging the cost at which it was preserved risks repeating the same cycle of misuse. We like to imagine that we have outgrown such brutality, that we are more rational, more ethical, more capable of handling disruptive truths. History suggests otherwise. Power still fears destabilization. Institutions still suppress narratives that threaten legitimacy. Truth is still filtered, reframed, and buried when inconvenient. The tools have changed. The instinct has not. If the Templar story teaches anything, it is that knowing too much too early can be lethal, not only to individuals but to societies unprepared for change. Their fate stands as a reminder that truth alone does not liberate. Wisdom does, and wisdom often arrives slowly, painfully, through failure and reflection. The Templars paid the price so that others might one day ask questions in a world capable of surviving the answers. Whether we are that world is still uncertain. But if we ever stand at the threshold of whatever was hidden, beneath ice, beneath time, beneath layers of silence, we will not encounter it as conquerors. We will encounter it as inheritors. An inheritance carries obligation, to remember the cost, to honor the restraint, and to recognize that some of the greatest sacrifices in history were made not to reveal truth, but to protect humanity from encountering it before it was ready. By the time the centuries had passed, the Templars had become more legend than reality, more myth than institution. The chronicles of Europe recorded their fall with horror and fascination. The tales of torture and betrayal forever intertwined with whispered rumors of hidden knowledge and unimaginable wealth. Yet beneath these stories lies a quieter, more enduring truth. The Templars' greatest legacy may not be what they possessed, but what they preserved. Preservation requires vision. It requires a temporal awareness that most humans cannot sustain. The Templars understood that civilizations are fragile, that empires rise and fall like tides, that knowledge unguarded is knowledge lost. They also understood that their own order, no matter how powerful, was not immune to these rhythms. The arrests of 1307 were inevitable, the trials, executions, and confiscations almost predictable once royal ambition and financial desperation converged. And yet, the order had spent decades preparing for exactly this eventuality. The disappearance of the Templar fleets, the secretive movement of archives, the scattering of their most capable brothers. These actions were not panic, they were strategy. They understood that physical destruction of their bodies would not erase the ideas, maps, and knowledge they had gathered over 2 centuries. The Templars' work had always been dual. Outwardly pious and martial, inwardly meticulous and archival. A balance between service to God and stewardship of truths too powerful for an unprepared world. To follow the trail of what they may have preserved requires thinking beyond conventional history. Maps from the medieval period show anomalies, lands drawn faintly, coastlines traced with peculiar accuracy, not visible to contemporary European explorers. Ancient texts hint at knowledge from distant and unknown lands, preserved through oral traditions and encoded writing. And centuries later, explorers and cartographers like Pyrie Reis compiled charts showing coastlines and landmasses remarkably accurate compared to modern geography, some even hinting at regions long concealed beneath ice. While these maps are debated and often dismissed as coincidence or legend, they represent a pattern that is difficult to ignore when considering the possibility that the Templars were stewards of knowledge beyond immediate comprehension. Antarctica, in particular, emerges as a recurring locus in this story. It is, in a sense, the perfect repository. Remote, hostile, and unyielding, yet uniquely capable of preserving whatever is placed beneath its ice. Unlike fortified cities or guarded castles, it does not rely on human loyalty or surveillance. Its defenses are environmental and temporal. Ice preserves, slows decay, and renders access arduous. ensuring that only those who approach with patience, preparation, and restraint will reach what lies beneath. For a group dedicated to long-term preservation, the frozen continent is not simply a geographic endpoint. It is a philosophical extension of their mission. It is a natural vault whose impenetrability mirrors the discipline the Templars applied to their inner knowledge. The centuries that followed the fall of the Order saw intermittent curiosity about what had been lost. Certain nations and secretive groups pursued myths, legends, and maps, but their efforts were often frustrated or misdirected. In the 20th century, Nazi Germany took an obsessive interest in the far south, sending expeditions and seeking to connect with perceived ancient legacies. This pursuit, though morally repugnant, underscores the enduring magnetic power of hidden knowledge. Some truths attract attention across generations, compelling repeated attempts at access, and Antarctica's harsh environment acts as both lure and barrier, ensuring that only the most determined, and often most prepared, explorers can even approach the idea of uncovering it. Operation High Jump in 1946 further emphasizes this intersection of ambition and limitation. The scale of the operation was staggering. Thousands of personnel, ships, aircraft, and logistical support sent to Antarctica in a display of capability unprecedented in peacetime. While officially framed as a scientific and military exercise, the abrupt conclusion of the expedition, along with Admiral Byrd's comments on the potential threat of aircraft capable of global reach, hints at the presence of unknown variables or at least a caution informed by past experience. Whether the expedition uncovered anything extraordinary is unclear. What remains certain is that the continent commands respect and enforces restraint even on the most technologically advanced nations. Its very hostility shapes human behavior, discouraging casual exploration and ensuring that engagement occurs only under carefully controlled conditions. This pattern of careful stewardship mirrors the Templars' philosophical approach to knowledge. They did not guard relics or documents merely to hoard power. They recognized that access without understanding is dangerous, that the premature revelation of truths, whether theological, historical, or geographic, can destabilize societies. Their methods were conservative not out of cowardice, but out of foresight. Dispersal, secrecy, and strategic inaccessibility ensured that knowledge would survive beyond political upheaval, persecution, and generational forgetfulness. Modern scientific exploration of Antarctica continues this theme in subtle ways. Researchers prioritize preservation, avoid contamination of subglacial lakes, and limit human interference, echoing the same principles the Templars would have valued: restraint, patience, and ethical engagement with the unknown. The continent is not treated as a resource to be exploited indiscriminately. It is approached as a fragile environment that preserves a record far older than the histories written by kings, priests, and scholars. The methods may be scientific rather than mystical, but the ethical principle is remarkably similar. Consider also the psychological weight of such preservation. To place knowledge or material at the end of the world is to relinquish immediate reward. It is to embrace uncertainty and accept that the benefits may not be realized for centuries. The Templar strategy required the suppression of human desire, to forego recognition, wealth, or even the certainty that their efforts would matter. This is a profound lesson in deferred action and long-term thinking, one that resonates with contemporary concerns about sustainability, climate change, and global stewardship. In both cases, the challenge is the same: how to act responsibly in a world dominated by short-term incentives and limited perspective. There is also a narrative power in absence. What is hidden becomes mythic precisely because it is unavailable. The Templars' disappearance, the scattering of fleets, the silent transport of knowledge. These actions transformed practical preservation into legend. Stories of lost treasure, secret maps, and hidden sanctuaries persist because absence demands imagination. But absence is not just a narrative device. It is an active strategy. It ensures survival by diverting attention, discouraging premature intrusion, and allowing knowledge to endure under conditions of enforced patience. The ethical dimension of this strategy is compelling. Preservation at the cost of personal and collective recognition requires moral foresight. The Templars accepted suffering and death as part of their duty, understanding that the value of what they protected exceeded their own lifespans and the political needs of their contemporaries. Antarctica, if it served as the ultimate repository, is a natural extension of this ethic. A place where knowledge is protected not by force alone, but by difficulty, hostility, and the passage of time itself. Ultimately, the Templars' story challenges modern assumptions about power, secrecy, and legacy. True influence is not always immediate or visible. The most significant actions often unfold across generations, their impact invisible until the world is ready to comprehend it. The Order's disappearance, their dispersed fleets, and the possible preservation of critical knowledge at the end of the world all point to a philosophy that values stewardship over dominion, foresight over impulse, and restraint over exploitation. Antarctica, in this light, is not just a frozen continent. It is a moral and philosophical statement. Its vast, inhospitable expanses embody the principles the Templars practiced: patience, caution, ethical engagement, and the prioritization of long-term preservation over short-term gain. If knowledge exists there, it is preserved not merely by ice and distance, but by design, echoing the Templars' centuries-old commitment to safeguarding truths too dangerous to reveal prematurely. The convergence of medieval secrecy, cartographic anomaly, esoteric philosophy, and modern scientific caution illustrates a remarkable continuity of human behavior: the recognition that certain knowledge demands protection. The Templars' foresight, the myths of their hidden treasures, the magnetic pull of Antarctica, and the careful approach of contemporary researchers are all part of the same narrative thread. A story about how humanity grapples with the weight of truth, the fragility of civilizations, and the ethical responsibility to preserve what might one day guide a wiser future. The lesson is profound. Survival of knowledge is not about dominance. It is about endurance. Preservation requires patience, and patience requires ethical discipline. The Templars may have understood this instinctively. Modern explorers, knowingly or not, continue to engage with the same principle. Antarctica remains not just a physical frontier, but a philosophical one, the ultimate repository for truths too powerful, too fragile, or too dangerous to be entrusted to the fleeting present. The Templar story does not end with the dissolution of their order, nor with the scattering of their brothers across Europe. It continues in the shadows, woven into myths, maps, and hidden histories, waiting for those who understand patience and secrecy. Their disappearance was not merely physical. It was strategic, philosophical, and deliberate. They knew that the preservation of knowledge requires a willingness to endure erasure and to trust in forces larger than themselves. And Antarctica, remote and inhospitable, may have been the ultimate expression of this understanding. To comprehend the full magnitude of this strategy, we must think in terms of systems rather than individuals. The Templars were masters of logistics, finance, and information. Their networks spanned continents. Their fleets could carry not only goods but knowledge, encoded in objects, charts, and even the careful alignment of buildings and fortresses. Every commandery, every monastery, every chapel was a node in a network designed to sustain continuity even in the face of catastrophic disruption. Their disappearance from Europe did not dissolve the network. It dispersed it. Knowledge moved where it could be protected, away from prying eyes, away from political manipulation, away from exploitation. The philosophy underpinning this approach is subtle yet profound. Knowledge is not power unless it can be understood and applied responsibly. In the wrong hands, it becomes a tool of destruction. This principle echoes through the centuries, from the Templars to secretive societies, from lost civilizations to the cautious exploration of the Antarctic continent in modern times. Antarctica is more than geography. It is a repository designed by nature to enforce restraint, to demand preparation, and to reward patience. For centuries, explorers approached Antarctica with curiosity tempered by fear. The continent's environment is harsh, indifferent, and unforgiving. Ships and equipment are tested to their limits. Lives are risked for minimal immediate reward. Yet these hardships mirror exactly the kind of selection the Templars would have valued. Only those who approach with foresight, discipline, and ethical intent are capable of reaching the most remote, dangerous, and potentially significant areas. In this sense, The landscape itself enforces a form of moral filtration, ensuring that knowledge preserved there is not casually seized, misinterpreted, or exploited. Consider the broader implications of this strategy. The Templars were not just preserving maps or documents. They were preserving understanding. Understanding that human civilizations are transient, that progress is fragile, and that knowledge divorced from ethical application can be catastrophic. They may have glimpsed evidence of lost civilizations, catastrophic cycles, or advanced knowledge that had been forgotten. To reveal such truths prematurely would have destabilized societies built on linear history and the illusion of permanence. To protect the continuity of civilization, they had to hide what they knew, sometimes for centuries, sometimes for millennia. This perspective recontextualizes the legends of Templar treasure. What people imagined as chests of gold or silver may have been metaphorical rather than literal. The true treasure could have been information, maps, star charts, astronomical calculations, geological observations, or encoded instructions on preservation and survival. Gold corrodes and physical wealth invites theft. Knowledge, when carefully guarded, transcends empires, survives destruction, and shapes future generations. Preserved properly, it can guide humanity through crises that might otherwise repeat the mistakes of the past. The continuity of this knowledge across centuries is reflected in anomalous maps, obscure manuscripts, and enduring myths. Cartographers like Pyri Reis inherited fragments of older knowledge, some of which depict coastlines or landmasses surprisingly consistent with modern observations of Antarctica's subglacial topography. These maps suggest that knowledge of lands beyond ice existed long before official discovery, preserved through networks that may have included Templar intermediaries. While the provenance of these maps is debated, their existence demonstrates the remarkable persistence of information across time and the potential for human ingenuity to safeguard truth under extreme circumstances. The ethical dimension of the Templars' preservation strategy is equally compelling. To protect knowledge, they had to forego recognition, wealth, and even survival. Silence became a moral imperative. Martyrdom was preferable to disclosure. And by choosing erasure, they ensured that the information they protected would outlast immediate political, social, or ideological pressures. This approach transforms the understanding of their historical downfall. It was not a failure but a calculated sacrifice intended to secure the longevity of what truly mattered. Antarctica embodies the philosophical principles the Templars practiced. Its ice, isolation, and extreme climate function as natural safeguards. Knowledge placed there is insulated from exploitation, misinterpretation, or accidental destruction. Access requires preparation, patience, and humility, qualities aligned with the Templars' ethical framework. In this sense, the continent is not merely a repository. It is a moral testing ground. Only those capable of restraint and long-term thinking can even attempt to engage with what may lie beneath the ice. Modern scientific practices echo this principle, even if unintentionally. Protocols surrounding subglacial lakes, careful sampling, and environmental protections reflect a recognition that premature or careless engagement can irreversibly alter or destroy what is preserved. These practices, whether guided by law, ethics, or practical necessity, mirror the Templar instinct for measured stewardship. Antarctica enforces a kind of ethical patience. To uncover too quickly is to risk destruction. To proceed without understanding is to undermine the purpose of preservation itself. The continuity from the medieval Templars to modern Antarctic exploration is striking. Both recognize the fragility of civilizations and the potential danger of knowledge in the wrong hands. Both employ systems, whether social, logistical, or environmental, to protect what matters. And both rely on time as a safeguard, acknowledging that some truths are not ready to be integrated into society until the world evolves to a point where understanding can match capability. This lens also reframes historical obsessions with Antarctica. From Nazi expeditions to Cold War military operations, repeated attention to the continent suggests an intuitive understanding of its significance. Expeditions were often framed as scientific, strategic, or exploratory, yet their scale, secrecy, and sudden conclusions hint at something more profound. The recognition that the continent may hold knowledge or evidence whose premature exposure could be destabilizing. The repeated fascination of powerful organizations underscores the enduring allure of what lies hidden at the ends of the earth. Ultimately, the Templars' choice to preserve knowledge through erasure and dispersion embodies a philosophy of stewardship over ownership, foresight over immediate gain, and moral responsibility over power. Antarctica, with its natural ability to enforce patience and restraint, may represent the ultimate extension of this philosophy, a location where the preservation of knowledge aligns with ethical discipline, environmental endurance, and temporal foresight. It is a space that enforces the same principles the Templars practiced, but on a planetary scale. In reflecting on the Templars' legacy, it becomes clear that their influence extends far beyond battles, politics, or religious conflict. It resides in the understanding that some truths are too powerful, too fragile, or too disruptive to be revealed before the world is ready. By choosing absence, dispersion, and concealment, they enacted a strategy that transcended the lifespan of their order. Antarctica, silent and immutable, may stand as the most literal manifestation of that strategy. A vault at the end of the world, protecting knowledge until humanity earns the capacity to receive it responsibly. This perspective invites a reconsideration of history itself. The Templars are no longer simply a medieval military and religious order. They are a case study in ethical stewardship, temporal foresight, and the long-term preservation of critical knowledge. Their story challenges modern assumptions about power, secrecy, and responsibility, suggesting that the most enduring influence is often invisible, intangible, and slow to emerge. Antarctica, as a repository shaped by nature and human foresight alike, symbolizes the culmination of these principles. Knowledge preserved not for glory or profit, but for survival, understanding, and the ethical continuity of civilization itself.